Hello, welcome to the 2022 Bay Planning Coalition Dredging and Beneficial Reuse Workshop. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors. First and foremost, the Port of Redwood City. Thank you for sponsoring this workshop. We have our workshop series sponsors, Geosyntec, Manson, WRA, HDR, Arcadis, SFO, Anchor QEA, and Moffett and Nickel. And finally, our gold tier and President's Club sponsors, ESA, Cargill, Briscoe, Ivester and Basil, LLP, Gelati Construction Company, Chevron, Fenmore Wendell, Sonoma Water, and Valley Water. Thank you very much for making today possible. So I'm very excited to see some of you in person because I'm very tired of Zoom meetings. Sorry to those of you on Zoom. And as I was thinking about today, I was thinking, gosh, I'm also really, really tired of that cliched phrase, uncertain times. I think we've all heard it 20 times a week since the pandemic started. And then I started thinking what to talk about. And I kept thinking, what do we say during these very uncertain times? And I decided I'm just going to dive headfirst into the cliche because really there's no better way to explain what we're seeing right now. And that's okay because as some of you might remember, the Bay Planning Coalition started during some pretty uncertain times, the 1980s mudlock. I'm, of course, too young to remember that, but I've been told that it was a time before industry and the regulatory groups had really learned to, play in the sandbox together. And it was pretty difficult to get what maybe industry considered timely approvals. So a group of intelligent, experienced, and pretty feisty folks got together and started the Bay Planning Coalition. And they put dredging at the cornerstone of the new organization. And at that time, a lot of new policies, streamlined, processes came into play. And we still see and benefit from a lot of those today. But we also have a host of new problems. We're seeing the economy is bonkers. And because of that, bid prices are all over the place. And it makes budgeting very difficult for owners. We're also strangely much dredging. We're getting surprises left and right. Like some of you may know, SF10 shut down recently. And all of the sediment going to SF10 has to go to SF11 now. There's just too much to keep up with. And then on a much larger scale, we're seeing a lot of changes in the workforce. I don't know if it's shifting priorities on a personal level, but there's a big chunk of the workforce missing, and it's hitting everybody. Owners, they're losing some of their experienced staff who maybe knew how to plan for dredging in advance, so they're behind. Consultants are struggling to keep up with last minute requests that they've never seen before. I know the regulators are really struggling with the piles of consultation requests and permit applications that are coming in. And what is concerning me is I see the dredging industry themselves, they're having a hard time finding staff for their crews. So they're not meeting the production rates they used to. And because of that, we're looking at a lot of projects maybe needing to go beyond the window if allowed. So there are a lot of problems. And unfortunately, the solutions from yesterday can't anticipate the problems of tomorrow. But I'm still feeling pretty good about what I'm seeing. I'm pretty inspired by actually some of you are here today, which is great. I'm seeing some things I think we all need to embrace. There are a few who are seeing what's happening and they're planning very early. A few owners started planning 18 to 24 months in advance for dredging, which I haven't seen. And, gold star to you. That's fantastic. I'm also seeing people being a lot more honest and transparent with their intentions. I feel like for a while it was put on a show and try to win that negotiation. And I'm seeing a little bit less of it. I think people are just fatigued and they're laying it out on the table. And that's creating a much more, mutually trustful environment where we can really get to a solution faster. And then my favorite that kind of shocked me is I'm seeing a lot more patience out of people. I think early on we were all very frustrated, at our wits' end, and it's kind of evolved into just more patience. We're all human. We all make mistakes. We can't foresee everything. And it's more of a, okay, fine, you messed up, I forgot something. Let's just move on and fix this. So I applaud all of you that are doing that. And I think with these ongoing workshops that you've had the foresight, Josh, to have annually, we're going to keep on top of the evolving nature of the industry. I think with the patience and the honesty and the planning, we're going to be okay. So I think we can collectively say, uncertain times, we see you, we know you're there, and we are not afraid of you at all. So come at us. So good job, everyone. I'm really, really proud of us, the Bay Area Dredging Group. So with that, I would like to hand it over to our fearless leader in the Bay Area dredging realm, the chair of the Dredging and Beneficial Reuse Committee, Josh Gravenmier.
Thank you, Jaclyn. And thanks for your kind words to start us off. That's great. Uncertain times, you're right. They continue to follow us. But I think you hit it on the head with open, honest collaboration and discussions, and that's what this meeting is about. Right? We want to bring together the stakeholders, the dredging community, the consultants, the regulators, etc., so that we can have an open dialogue, so that we can address the issues. Right? Dredging in the Bay Area is the most expensive in the nation, right? And so because of that, we're always talking about money. They're talking about money in other locations too, but especially in the Bay Area. And when you're looking at appropriations and why does the Bay Area need more than others? It's the same here as it is there, but well, it isn't, right? So we want to make sure that this community is continually talking. We're pushing the envelope and we're addressing the issues head on. To that end, we have a really good program for you today that I'm excited about. We'll start off with the integration and discussion with the DMMO agencies. I thought this would be a really good behind the scenes thing that maybe not everybody in the audience gets all the time. Bay Planning has been working on dredging issues for a long time, but in the last number of years, we went from more of a reactionary mode to being more proactive and engaging with the agencies and the community so that we can understand what's coming down the pipe before it really hits us. And so one of that main things that we've been doing is having about every 3 times a year or so DMMO program manager meetings. And so there we get to talk, pretty candidly. It took a little while. The first few meetings, we were kind of feeling each other out. But now I think now that we've done it for a number of years, it's really open and honest communication. Where are the data gaps that we see? Where do we need to go? What are the issues? Sea level rise is happening. We need more sediment in the bay. We're trying this new pilot study. So there's a lot of different things there. So what I challenged the agency folks that are going to talk to us today about was to give an idea of where they think dredging is going. Where do they think the issues are, and highlight some of the things that they're doing for the dredging community that you may not be aware of. Everyone's working in the same direction, but we're doing it in different speeds, and we're all constrained a little bit by our agencies where we work from, and so we have different viewpoints. And so I thought it'd be great to talk about it in that respect, and then we'll transition from there to our updates for the beneficial reuse sites. And there we talked about, we'll do an annual update, what's happening at this, that, and the other site, but also where and how long will those sites be around, right? They're not there forever. And we need to be looking at the next sites and paying forward the lessons learned at the sites that we have to the new sites. And then trying to organize that then to, how do we pay for it? That's always our big aspect, right? We have infrastructure bills in California that talk about bridges and roads and all these things, but we stop short of the dredge channels to get the material there, right? And then some of the science that's going on, we'll have SFEI talk to us too, etc. And then at the end, we'll have hopefully an interesting perspective for everybody that Mr. Bridges will be talking about the bridge with nature and how can we move things forward there, and maybe challenge us both on the private side and on the regulatory side. So looking forward to all that. And I don't know, Cameron, if we hadn't talked about this beforehand, but how do you want to do the questions as they might pop up from the people in the audience that are on Zoom? Okay, well, I'm not going to be looking at them, so you can tell me how that goes. So, all right. Well, looking forward to this discussion. I think we're right about on time. If we wanted to move to the next slide, I think then we'll get into the first panel. And so we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. So with us today, we didn't get everybody that we wanted, but we definitely are happy to have EPA, Army Corps, DC to talk with us. We'll get their perspective, and I think Jennifer is going to be the first to talk about it, her perspective from the EPA. And you want to pull up her slides, and hopefully Jennifer, you're out there.
Yes.
I couldn't tell.
I am out here. I was trying to turn my video on as directed, but it says the host has stopped it. So
same for me here, Steve Goldman.
yeah, so Cameron, I'm not sure how to address that, but if you can pull up the slides, that'd be great, Cameron. Thank you. So I just want to say thank you for the opportunity for us to, come and have these transparent and open discussions about problem solving and where we're at and what we've done. And yeah, a little bit behind the curtain on, at least on the agency side of the house, which is good. I really love Jaclyn's opening remarks about pragmatic, patient problem solving. This has honestly been one of the strangest dredging seasons certainly I've been involved in. So a lot of complex moving parts. So really, really looking forward to, everybody has a role and responsibility to play, and working with the industry can do nothing but help us. So I'm also going to be, so Melissa France is also with us, as Josh indicated. She's with the Dredging Material Management Office, and she will also be piping in on these slides. We're going to do a little bit of a duo there. Oh, I should be able to start my video. Excellent. I love seeing my face on Zoom. Yay. So next slide, please. So I'm not gonna belabor the point on the history of the LTMS and what we've accomplished. But I did just want to point out that there's a lot of milestones and documentations behind the program. It's served us really well over the last 20 years. And so really kind of finding ways to work within that programmatic program that will allow us to continue to do the streamlining and the problem solving that we've done so far. Also, I really encourage people to look at that 2001 final management plan. I reviewed it again last week, and I was like, wow, this was pretty forward looking, particularly for beneficial reuse. So when you have some time, take another look at it, and at the goals that were established, and how we were planning to accomplish them. So I will cover LTMS partnership goals and benefits, and then Melissa will come in with DMMO efforts, and then we'll talk jointly about beneficial reuse challenges. So next slide, please. Sorry, I'm going to talk a little bit here. So there's 4 co-equal goals that were established by the LTMS. Many of you are familiar with this. And I just kind of want to refresh what we have accomplished as a community. We have numerous federal channels, about 11, hundreds of marinas and harbors and ports that need regular maintenance. We have 2 to 3 million cubic yards of maintenance dredging that happens per year. Thus far, we've had 65 million cubic yards dredged since 2000. Dredging has continued. There haven't been lawsuits that have stopped dredging. We have also not triggered any allocations that were established by the LTMS program. So I think that's a win and something to remember. We have also done this in an environmentally sound and transparent way. And, by really having properly standardized and characterized sediment, and ensuring that there's adequate capacity for, not only in-bay sites, but alternatives to the in-bay sites, as Josh alluded to. We've really been able to increase public confidence, manage the in-bay sites, certainly a little hiccup this year, but and then, we've also had the ocean site, which really was set up to provide that third safety valve is what I meant, option. So, kind of keeping that in context is important. And what we're talking about today is really maximizing dredge material as a resource and not a waste. And 28 million cubic yards to date have been used to build tidal wetlands around the bay. The costs, the logistics are still high. The hope with the LTMS program was that these limited reuse sites would come online and be available, and we would have 20 years to get those new restoration sites permitted and going. And we have, the community has made progress on that. We have quite a few beneficial reuse sites that are open and accepting material now. We also have new ones coming online. So we are tracking that as the LTMS agencies. The other thing I want to point out, Josh asked me about, what the DMMO is doing and these permitting frameworks. Really, I cannot emphasize enough how streamlined the DMMO process and program has been for getting these projects done in a timely manner. There's a lot more certainty. The programmatic consultations allow for faster decisions. They also allow for, out of window work. With that, and that has allowed beneficial reuse to happen in unexpected ways as well. And we've not had any adverse environmental impacts in the bay or ocean or these other sites. So we've been able to achieve, the last thing I'll say is we've been able to achieve the goal of cutting down the amount of in-bay disposal from about 3 to 4 million to about 1.5 million cubic yards a year. That's what our goal is. And while the original alternative preference was to have 40% reuse, 40% ocean, and 20% in-bay, what we have maintained generally is 40% in-bay, 40% reuse, and 20% ocean. And that was, I believe, alternative 2. Next slide, please. And I'm going to pass the baton over to Melissa to talk about the DMMO and things that we've done there.
Hi, thank you for the invite. I'm really happy to be here. I hope you can hear me just fine. And I can see myself, and it's really dark in my house, so I'm really sorry. So as Jen said, we have a streamlined process to help process all these dredging applications, dredging permits, and we as a DMMO review up to 50 to 70 projects a year. So we try to streamline this as much as possible so that there's no hiccups, no bumps, and you can dredge within your appropriate window. The first thing we have for this is one application that will cover all the key agencies permits, as opposed to your typical Department of the Army, you know, the engineering 4345 form. This one application will meet the minimum requirement for the key agencies. And yeah, we might ask you for additional information, but overall the process moves pretty quickly, relatively speaking. What helps us streamline the process, as Jen mentioned, is the programmatics we have in place. Programmatics for ESA, EFH, CISA, the work window compliance. So if you avoid the species mitigation period, there's no need to consult. And I know that BCDC, I think Steve will talk to that, just updated their web-based eelgrass tool to ID projects easier in proximity to eelgrass. We have the 1600, the LSA, the 1600, the stream bed alteration. There's programmatic alternatives analysis, the IAAs, the small dredgers. All of these programmatics significantly reduce the permitting process from years. I've seen, as coming from the regulatory side, I've seen most permits, if they're not nationwide permits, they can take from somewhere up to 6 months to 5 years. So we reduce this permit processing from years to months and maybe days. The Army Corps permit is typically good for 10 years unless otherwise specified, like if it's a nationwide, if you're disposing upland. Sometimes the permits outlast the issuing regulators. So I might issue you a permit, and 10 years when you come back, it might be someone else and they'll have to explain what I did. We hold bi-weekly meetings that are open to the public. And this is your one-stop, get all the agencies together, a meeting to receive sediment and sampling testing guidance and a follow-up test results review. You get your one-stop for sediment sampling, testing, and suitability calls. And there's stuff happening with the DMO database. I'm sure Melissa will speak to that later. And we're currently finalizing the SFEI evaluation of PCBs, bioaccumulation testing thresholds to inform the current EFH programmatic consultation. And next slide, I'll pass it back to Jen.
Thanks, Melissa. So just to get to the point here, so here's our current, what we see as current challenges for reuse. You know, mudlock, as Jaclyn mentioned, that's where we started. So, you know, that's 30 years in the rearview mirror. So just remembering, you know, that's why I like to bring up the streamlining and collaboration that we do on an everyday basis to help folks. Also, you know, high dredging costs remain. I already mentioned that with the core budgets, the biggest dredger, they remain flat. And reuse sites remain a high cost option. The market does not seem to be responding. And the ocean's not far behind on costs. So, you know, while we envisioned cost equalizing as more sites came on, that's not quite happened. So we need to look at creative ways for, you know, legislative and funding mechanisms that can help us do some cost sharing for those costs. I think there's also, you know, some evolving things with Corps' headquarter policies, you know, with the worders that we've seen. and really wanting to see more local discretion at least be balanced with some of that headquarter policy. As we all know, the federal standard can impede reuse. So, we're really looking to find where we can get that flexibility for reasonable cost share. We don't want the federal government to pay all of the cost, all of the high cost of dredging. It's a village. We need to do this together. And we have been exploring, we had some cost contracting flexibilities a few years ago. That has now changed. We are working with the Corps now on the Oakland Channel Harbor O&M pilot to put 50% in bay, 50% beneficial reuse. And so far, so good. There has been success getting the contract, the low cost contract has worked with getting 50% in bay, 50% beneficial as the federal standard. So that's good. Our other challenges, as we know, are we need more sediment. And so I just want to be really careful with our words here. Sediment deficit, by putting more sediment into the bay, is not necessarily going to equal, greater marsh sea level rise resiliency. Direct mechanisms, direct placement, whether it's, from a pipe, from the barge to the marsh to thin layer placement, whatever those direct placement mechanisms are, they're still going to be critical. I know we don't have the full data from the section 1122 indirect placement, but looking at that preliminary data, direct placement is still going to be critical. That's the biggest prize here, and we need to focus on it. Next slide, please. So just to kind of continue that theme of the village, where have we as the agencies been doing, turning different levers to try to get more beneficial reuse? And, EPA in particular is very dedicated to facilitating and coordinating and looking outside, our traditional partnerships to find where we can get funding for beneficial reuse. Especially in light of all the bill funding, the IRA funding that's come from the federal government. How do we key in to get that money to where it needs to be, which is cost share for beneficial reuse? So we already have great state partnerships. There's been an influx of that money to California Sea Level Rise Leadership Team. And I think Steve might be talking about some of that later, but, State Coastal Conservancy has been a great cost share partner. BCDC and OPC have initiatives. So we really want to make sure that we're tracking where that money is going, and we need to message and directly tie wetland restoration using beneficial reuse as a sea level rise tool. If we can message that, we can get more money. Measure AA, we've had some success for getting direct placement cost share. BPC, you guys have been great on legislative efforts, as well as SEC and BCDC of trying to get appropriations in addition to authorizations. And we need to make sure that money is used efficiently and as intended. From a regulatory perspective, Steve's going to be talking about, all the things that BCDC is doing. Water Board has adjusted their basin plan to accommodate fill for reuse. We've completed quite quick turnaround reviews for reuse site conditions, such as early last year, maybe it was last year. I don't know, I'm losing track of time with COVID, but Montezuma needed to do some early breaching to permit their filling of the foundation cells. And the DMMO agencies, got on it, and we helped to make that happen. We also do numerous times where we get on the phone with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for Coleman to discuss reuse criteria and how we can get projects to that site. We've also been doing preliminary conversations, coordination, and analysis. BCDC has done a preliminary analysis for permitting an offloader. So that's handling kind of, one of those equipment logistics issues. EPA has also funded a very important upcoming BCDC collaborative that you guys have heard about. This is going to be held with the Water Board, is going to help facilitate that. And we're going to have stakeholder workshopping to look at, really, how do we increase beneficial reuse, looking at a results chain analysis to really pin down some actionable tasks to support reuse. We're also, BCDC is going to be looking at policy improvements in the Bay Plan and a financing strategy to support reuse. And I think that's really going to have some good outputs. I'm talking a lot. I did want to talk about the federal O&M program, right? Again, their partnership is key. They've been at the table for the last 30 years as well. And we've all experienced different mandates and things and challenges with those mandates and how we implement. So really, you know, the core is, like I said, partnering with the LTMS agencies on the Oakland Harbor. We're still looking, there's other mechanisms at play here. There's some congressional directives from WRDA 2020 on the section 125C reuse section implementation. It's been slow since 2020, so 2 years, but there recently has been some new supplemental implementation guidance about, it's called a BUDDY, a beneficial use site decision document addendum to the 20-year DMMP. I'm hoping Stu or Tessa can talk about that later, but that looks very promising to basically try to inform the DMMPs and the federal standards with new beneficial sites that are coming online, or that would be coming online. I think Stu's also going to be talking about the RDMMP update process, which is underway and ongoing and critical. And it's important that that document be aligned with our LTMS regional goals. Melissa, do you want to give a quick update of the RDMMP, or are we sorry? Are we saving that for Stu? I don't want to.
I think I'm gonna save it for Stu.
Okay.
Let me see what I have for it, but I'm not the expert on it, and I can't speak to it.
Okay.
So I'm going to defer to Stu or Tessa or Julie Beagle. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. Anything else on this slide? Oh, there's a couple cool initiatives that I really want to talk about that the regulatory and resource agencies have been doing that you may or may not have heard of. There has been an action to look at innovative studies on the use by ESA fish for restored wetlands. And they're working with the Corps on that in lieu of the ESEON's fish entrainment monitoring, which wasn't able to be done due to COVID considerations. So that's kind of an innovative study for an alternative mitigation. So we're very interested in how that's going to work out. The LTMS agencies have also been heavily involved in supporting science initiatives at the RMP. And we're also ensuring that we're plugging into the evolving WRMP for sediment, right? And again, that mobile offloader interest, that's another aspect, another lever that we're pushing. We threw a whole lot at you, but on this last slide, can you just go to the very last slide? Yeah, so this is really less of the agencies and more of the industry and BPC. But I really would like, especially from EPA's perspective, I'm very interested in helping to find where funding's happening, where it's going, how can we get more, how can we message better. So some non-traditional funding that I've seen come through this year from the federal government has been quite interesting. So I will stop there. Thank you so much. Are we answering questions now?
I see the one in the Q&A.
We talked to Steve.
Okay, let's talk to Steve. Perfect.
Am I not on? Okay. Hello. Apparently I wasn't on. We'll wait until the end. Thanks for your summary, guys. I really appreciate it. I didn't get a chance to talk with Steve Beck beforehand. And Steve, maybe I can put you on the spot a little bit. To talk a little bit about what
I'm sorry, I can't hear. All of a sudden it's gone mumbly. There's something wrong with the feed, I think.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can hear me? Yes. I don't know. Well, Steve, I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can, maybe you can talk a little bit about the difficulties it was for permitting before the DMMO, and then maybe some of the initiatives that BCDC is looking to do with on the horizon. Anyway, I know you came in at the last minute here, so we're giving you a little bit of a curveball, but I'm sure you can talk easily with these things.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes. And now I can hear you just fine. For a while there, it just turned into something I couldn't tell. So thanks for inviting me and thanks for having me. And Brenda Gaden gives her regrets. She's actually went to the Netherlands to present at a conference there on the work that we're all doing here and addressing beneficial reuse and dredging management in San Francisco Bay. But I will try to fill in. And yes, I was here back in the days of Mudlock prior to the LTMS and the Dredged Material Management Office, and helped work with the various stakeholders to stand up the LTMS, do the LTMS studies. I actually managed the Upland studies work as a part of the program. And we created the Dredged Material Management Office. And before that, it really was a problem because dredging had become very, very controversial. Disposal in the bay was difficult, and the Alcatraz site that's supposed to be 100% dispersive had turned into a mound that was growing like topsy, and the dredging permits were being challenged by various groups because of the perceived issues there. And there was great debate as to what the impacts of dredging and disposal in the bay were. And there was no easy answer or solution that could resolve it, even though we've put a fair amount of time and money into studies. And what the LTMS was intended to do was to stop fighting and start talking and try to come up with solutions that we could all live with. And that's what it has done. And part of that, and one of the main issues of the LTMS, sorry, someone was calling me. One of the main issues was the permits, because when folks needed to have their area dredged and they applied for a permit, by the time they got their last permit, the first one had probably expired, and it was very difficult to process permits. So the idea of processing the applications collaboratively through the Dredged Material Management Office was a new thing, and that we established as a pilot project. And I think it has worked very, very well. And that's certainly something that we need to realize is an important and something that has withstood the test of time, but I don't think that we can rest on our laurels. And I think everybody in this room agrees that we need to continue to look at ways to achieve the goals. And I think back in the day, the idea of beneficially reusing dredged material was new, and we didn't really quite understand how we could get it done, but we knew that we needed to restore marshes. And since then, it's only become more important because of rising sea level and the fact that our wetlands need to be restored to retain the vitality of the bay. And if we don't beneficially reuse the material, we're probably going to lose a lot of those wetlands going forward. So that only intensifies the need for us all to be working collaboratively on this. But we all know that it's much more difficult to reuse the material, much more expensive. So to briefly talk a little bit more about what's already discussed on the EPA grant, which we got from the EPA. And thank you so much, EPA, for giving us this grant to do three things. And the first thing is to address what the potential methods of increasing beneficial reuse might be. And it's called an events chains analysis or something like that, but it's really working with all the stakeholders to try to take another look at the various ways we can reuse sediment from the bay. And it isn't just limited to navigational channels, but we also want to look at other sources of sediment like flood control channel dredging and even upland soils to restore and enhance wetlands in the bay. And so we think working through this process, we can try to rethink, just as we did at the LTMS, try to rethink how we were managing dredging in the bay. Let's look at the full range of ways that we might increase and enhance beneficial reuse. And so that's the first part of the grant. And I also want to mention that while most of the funding is coming from the Environmental Protection Agency, part of the funding is coming from the Ocean Protection Council. So thanks to them as well. And we'll be working very closely with the Estuary Institute and the San Francisco Bay joint venture on this project. And the Water Board will help us manage it and run it. And we'll be working with all of you and all of the stakeholders, because we don't think this is going to be our process. It's not going to happen in a closet somewhere and we tell everybody the result. We're going to be working very collaboratively with everyone on this. And so the second part of this is looking at how do we fund beneficial reuse, because we all recognize that that perhaps is one of the greatest problems we face right now for beneficially reusing material. Everybody wants to do it. We realize the importance of doing it, but how do we get it done and how do we pay for it and who pays for it? And so what we are thinking to do is work with the group that we engaged at BCDC to address funding adaptation to rising sea level. And we called the work group that we established the Financing the Future Work Group, which has some really good folks in finance and looking at creative ways to address financing. So we're going to work with them on this topic and see what we can do to increase funding at all levels and use new mechanisms to apply to this, because we really think that this is a part of climate change adaptation. And so we should be looking at that in context as well. Excuse me. And then the last part of it, and then I will shut up, is updating our Bay Plan policies on sediment. And that will be re-looking at the LTMS. And like was already said, we don't want to jettison what we've done, but we want to update it to look at current conditions, current challenges, and current opportunities. And that will also be a very public process that we will be doing at BCDC. And we will be establishing a sediment working group of commissioners that will help lead us through this. And it will be very much a stakeholder and public process going forward. So that's what we're looking to do over the next couple of years with all of you. And I invite you to join us in this, and hopefully we can find some innovative solutions and help us help us all move in the direction that we want to go. And I think that's all that I have to present right now, but we do have a new tool. Our GIS team at BCDC has been working to set up an online tool for looking at eelgrass locations in the bay in relation to the dredging sites to use as a part of our programmatic habitat work in permitting. So I can, if you want to contact me, I can send you the link if you want to look at that and avail yourself of that new tool. And with that, I will turn it back over to our hosts.
Well, thanks, Steve. Hopefully you can hear me. Maybe we can put all of our speakers on so we can kind of take a look at them and provide some opportunity for some Q&A. Everybody's perspective that they brought. I know at BPC we've been talking about updating LTMS for a while, so it was great, Steve, to hear that you're thinking about doing that, and BPC would be hopefully a great team with together with that. One of the other questions that happened to come up was something that you did touch on, Steve, and that was that the discussion of beneficial reuse needs to include upland material, not just dredged material. And so you were talking about other sources like the channels and whatnot. And so the question was that, hey, there's millions of cubic yards of material generated in each year in the Bay Area. How implement for to the critical areas, because it's not all dredge material. So I don't know if you guys, any one of you, it's not to anybody specific, but if you guys want to tackle that.
Unfortunately, you went in and out at the end, so the specifics of the question, could you repeat that, please?
After how will the agencies help supplement the cost for getting this material to the critical areas? Nothing.
Great.
Do I need to switch? Okay. Okay. Were you able to
Did
hear that? No.
Kind of, sort of.
How will the agencies help supplement the cost of getting this material to the critical areas?
Well, from BCDC standpoint, I don't want to just repeat what I just said, but we will be looking at the various measures that we can use to do that. And in the past, it was all about dredging and dredgers. And when we start looking at upland sediment, then that kind of broadens the approach that we can look at. And we're looking at the soil market, which the Coastal Conservancy can maybe talk about later, that they've been looking at for the South Bay salt ponds and other projects. And so it's kind of a different ballgame, and we'll just have to look at it again. And we're hoping some of the funds that the federal government and the state government have been providing for adaptation to rising sea level can be used for this. As always already mentioned, the Restoration Authority is providing funding for restoration efforts, and some of that funding potentially could apply. So there are some mechanisms, and what we want to do is just take a broad look and not come in thinking that it's going to be done on the back of the dredgers or that some miracle solution is going to happen, but that we are going to have to put together the various mechanisms that we have, and some that may be new ones that we can come up with to apply to this. So I don't have some magic solution, but perhaps one of our other presenters has some ideas they want to put forward as well.
Well, I'm still building my magic wand.
There we
It's not
go.
ready yet, but I will just say, yes, EPA absolutely agrees with everything you said, Steve. And that's why we are, putting a lot of eggs in the basket of looking at all types of sediment and soil that's available, and funding initiatives, particularly science initiatives from the San Francisco Water Quality Improvement Fund to connect watersheds, the upper watersheds with the lower watershed of the Bay. And we've given a lot of money to that, and we will continue to do that. So that's certainly a mechanism that we will utilize to keep that, and we'll stay involved in the conversations from both a granting and a policy perspective, as well as the technical. DMMO agencies have had a lot of discussion on, okay, so upland sediment, what's the criteria? How is that different from dredge sediment? So we are staying abreast of those technical conversations as well.
Well, anybody in the audience here have a question for the group? Okay. Is it in German? Oh, okay.
Okay, this is Todd Bridges. So the out of town.
Can you hear him?
So the out of towner. Okay. So you can treat the out of towner as blissfully ignorant. So if you could describe to me at a high level, how does the permitting process for a beneficial use project compare to the permitting process for a disposal project? You know, what are, if there are gaps there or significant differences, you know, what are your ideas for how to close that gap? The premise for my question obviously is I would expect maybe the permitting for a beneficial use project to be much more complicated and maybe take more time than a disposal process. And that needs to be reversed if you want to, you know, make it the default, the standard, but maybe my premise is wrong. So that's the end of my question.
No, thank you. And if you guys heard that, hopefully, I don't know who wants to take that.
Well, I can start off. And so what we set up in the Bay Area, which probably most of the folks in this conference know about, is the Restoration Authority that was voted in by with great popular support, that actually provides funding for restoration of bay wetlands and providing associated recreational benefits like public access. And so that's a great mechanism to provide some funding for these kinds of projects, but also the understanding was that they are more complex than just getting rid of the material, and that we needed to speed up and manage the process for these restoration projects, similar to what we did for the Dredged Material Management Office for navigational dredging projects. And so as a part of that, the agencies are collaborating in something called the BRIT, but it's the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team or something like that.
Interagency
Something
team.
like that. Yeah. So we all just affectionately call it the BRIT, just like the DMMO. And so that's doing the same kind of work that the DMMO is doing for the navigational dredging projects and testing and looking at the permitting process for the restoration projects. It was just stood up a couple of years ago, and it really is now starting to find its way. And as a part of that, there's also a team that's looking at policy issues associated. So they're not just getting together to work together to do it, but also looking at issues that may get in the way and how we resolve them. So so there are these two groups, and maybe we need greater collaboration. That's one thing we want to look at between them. That might be helpful. Not that anybody isn't doing that, but just maybe we need to find ways to mechanisms to institutionalize that. So that's probably the main approach. And as a part of the Bay Adapt program that BCDC has to look at rising sea level, we're also going to be looking at the regulatory aspects of adapting to rising sea level rise, and these projects are going to help us adapt. And so we're going to be looking at ways to improve the regulatory process there as well. So that's another mechanism that at least BCDC will be looking at for our processes.
Did you guys want to add anything to that? No, that's great, Steve. Thank you.
Well, again, everything Steve said.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, it's a really great question, Todd. And, you know, I think that's where we the agencies and, you know, industry came to about 4 or 5 years ago when we were looking at using Restoration Authority to set up the BRIT and, you know, looking at policy level issues that needed to be changed. And each of the agencies have taken on responsibility for one of those policies to try to change it so that we can, or modify it, or, you know, somehow make it better so that we can get these restoration sites permitted faster, because they have a myriad of multiple benefits. And so, yes, there's a full court press on the part of the regulatory and resource agencies. So I think that was pretty great, and Steve laid it out wonderfully. So I really can't add much.
Yes, Jen and Steve, they have it covered. Can't add too much to that.
One thing actually I want to add is that what we're finding through the BRIT is the most important thing is early consultation and collaboration in the permitting process. And the classic thing is you go out and you design your project, you get all the logistics set up, and then you go in to get a permit. And then all of a sudden the permitters is saying, well, but this aspect and that aspect, and then you go into do loops, and that's expensive, right? And time consuming. And so the idea is that if we can be working from early in project design, we can help you avoid some of the snafus that might arise. And then also we're up to speed, so we don't have to then go off and think about what you're doing because we already know what you're proposing, and now we have the specifics in the application. So I guess what I'm saying here is a pitch for folks doing these kinds of projects to come in early and talk with us and engage, because I think that's one of the best ways to speed the process and get you to the end game quickly. And something that we haven't mentioned here, but which is a push here and across the country, is social equity and environmental justice. And as a part of our policies, what our policies now require us to do at BCDC anyway, is to make sure that environmental justice and social equity is imbued in the permit process and everything we do at BCDC. And again, that has to happen throughout. It can't happen at the end. It has to happen throughout the process. So again, I really encourage folks to come in and be talking with us and the other regulator as you're going forward, and making sure that we're talking about that and you're engaging as needed the frontline communities and folks as you design and implement these projects. So sorry, but that's my little pitch. Thanks.
No, I agree. Please contact us early. Reach out to us. Schedule pre-application meetings. Bring all the questions you have, and we will answer them throughout and help you make this process less painful than it has to be. Yes, that's all.
I think that's really links in with the purpose of this meeting, right? Is we want to foster collaboration. We want to engage early and often. We want to make sure that there's some camaraderie here, right? We're all on the same page and we're all really working together. So I think we're just about the end of this timing for this session, but I really wanted to thank Jennifer, Melissa, and Steve for their time. This isn't a one-stop shop though, right? You know, BPC is going to be engaging with them and will continue in the future. And we look forward to that. So thanks again for your time, and hopefully you can stay on and be part of the next session. So really appreciate that. Now we'll transition to the next group, where we're going to do a beneficial site update, and Scott, you'll be the moderator for that. So thanks everybody for the first session.
And thank you so much. And we really can't do this work without the Bay Planning Coalition. So thanks for all your work and all your input.
Absolutely. Thanks. Okay, get in.
Me, so I got to speak up for you all to hear me back there. Thank you to our previous panel. My name is Scott Bodensteiner. I've been working with Josh and more recently with Jan Novak as co-chairs of the Dredging and Beneficial Reuse Committee of BPC, and had real privilege of working with the folks up at the table here and out in the room over there for most of my career, finding ways to get sediment from the bay and up into the beneficial reuse sites around the bay. And so what we're going to provide now, as we do every year, is a kind of a ground level update on the beneficial reuse sites around the bay that are up and running, and then an outlook on those that are forthcoming and burgeoning sites also around the bay for beneficial reuse of sediments. And I just want to start by saying, despite all the technical, logistical, funding challenges to beneficially reusing dredge material since the advent of the LTMS, the one consistent bright spot every year is that we always have a good mix of sites that are current, sites that are receiving dredge material, sites that have a substantial capacity to receive dredge material, and sites that are on the horizon. And so the same is true this year. We have a really good mix of sites that are currently operational, receiving dredge material, and sites that are, as you'll hear, on the near horizon, hopefully near horizon. We'll find out more about how near that is for beneficially reusing sediment. So that's what excites me every year, is that we do have these current and forthcoming sites, and I love hearing more about them every year. So we'll get started. And we do also have a good mix of, as you can see, in-person speakers and one person that's speaking remotely, Barbara, and we hope we have minimal distortion issues with her presentation, but our in-person folks will have a clear mic and a clear voice. And I'm just gonna, we didn't talk about this when we planned, but I think I'm just gonna go with the ones that are up and running already, and then we'll transition to Belmarine Keys and Tuscarora Marsh. So we'll start off with our first speaker here, Jim Levine, here to my right. Jim's a engineer, he's a philanthropist and an entrepreneur, and among all his different endeavors over the years, we're all fortunate that 25 years ago he decided to build Montezuma Wetlands Restoration Project, and has been receiving dredge material since the advent of the LTMS, and really got the whole beneficial reuse concept. And all the successes to date with beneficial reuse have been a lot dependent on Jim's project and Jim's work on that project. So Jim, please take it away.
Well, is it working? Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. Well, thanks for that really kind introduction. I think the first 10 years I was trying to make this project happen was not so nice to me. It was very, very difficult and required a lot of personal cash. And I questioned many, many times whether it was really worth it, but I'm totally convinced it was really worth it now. So I'll go through this update. For those of you who don't know about our project too much, this was a project to solve two regional problems. And sometimes we have found that with big problems, you sometimes can't solve them by themselves. You actually have to solve two or three together to actually get a solution. And so we were one of the first, I think, to realize that you could safely use dredge sediment to restore habitats. And I think we have come to the point where we think we need to just go beyond how do you safely use the material. We think we need to use the material to maximize wetland values in the Bay Area. Wetlands are the foundation of our ecosystem. And if you have read the paper at all, or any scientific papers, the ecosystem is really failing. And I don't think we have that much longer, actually. So I think we just need to be very judicious about how we use the material. Next slide. So we were one of the first, I think the second site to get permitted. We received all our permits in 2001, and we started operations in 2003. So we've been operating for 19 years continuously. The project is to restore 1,600 acres, a little more than 1,600 acres of historical tidal marsh in the null zone of the of the San Francisco Bay Estuary. That's where the freshwater and the saltwater meet. And the scientists convinced me early on that these were the most valuable wetlands in the entire Bay Area because of that. This is where the young fish would nurse before they were heading out to the ocean and the bay. The plan also includes rebuilding the port of Collinsville, port in the Bay Area. And as most of you know, I think we restored about 600 acres of phase 1 to the tides in October 2020. So I'll show some of the results of that. Because of our location, and I think our focus on efficiency, we are a fairly efficient alternative to ocean disposal. And for cover projects, we operated at about a cost differential of somewhere around $7 a yard, which is much less than the benefits that we get from having these wetlands. And I think the Corps is now allowed to consider those benefits. We also provide jobs and revenues to Solano County, and we offload all with operating engineers, union labor. Next slide. So here's where we're located. You can see our sites in red. We own 3,200 acres. And you can see we're right where the Sacramento River takes a big left-hand turn, which has been doing for thousands and thousands of years. And as such, it's scoured out the right bank. And so we have about 23 feet of water depth at low tide. That's what makes us so efficient. Next slide. I mentioned we went through extensive permitting. And then since operations had begun in 2003, really starting with the Port of Oakland's 50-foot project, we took 3.1 million yards from that. Without the Port of Oakland, we would not be here today operating. The people at the Port of Oakland have just been amazing supporters of doing the right thing in a lot of ways. Just want to say that. We take about 10 million cubic yards of sediment. So looking at other slides, about 40% of all the reuse amounts to date. We operate 24/7 when people need us. And we've now completed phase 1 of the site. We've maintained regular monitoring for water, sediment, and biologic monitoring. I'll show some of those results. And we've operated as reliable partners for project sponsors and regulatory agencies since we received our approvals. Next slide. So this is a little overview of our site operations. This is a little dated slide because phase 1, which is that white area in the middle of the slide, is now a viable wetland. But the barges pull up toward the southern part of our site in the deep water area there. So we can actually, even when we're not allowed to slurry the material with water from the bay, we store 65 million gallons of water on site that we pull out of shallow wells. And we can offload anytime, basically, 365, 24/7. We pump the material. We can pump up to 5 miles. We pump it. Phase 1 was about 2 miles. And then we recycle the water coming back, and then we make up additional water as we need to. Next slide. Here's how we do it. We were very fortunate to buy the Liberty offloader in the late 90s before we had even a place to put it. So that took quite a bit of discussions with my investors. Sometimes you have to do things and take some risk in order to make something happen. And we did this. So that Liberty has been a godsend. We spend about $500,000 to $1 million on maintenance every year. So anyone who wants to own a Liberty, beware. We have to sometimes turn around major repairs in 5 days or less. So it's a big industrial operation, and we draw up to 3 megawatts of power to run it. Next slide. The big update, we've done 2 years of monitoring since we restored phase 1 to the tides, and really beyond anything we ever expected. We've had just extraordinary recovery of tidal wetlands, vegetation, birds, salt bones, mice, and fish. I'll show you some of that. 2022 was good for beneficial reuse. The pilot project that was mentioned earlier, Larkspur, Manson decided to take all that to Coleman, and congratulations, Steve. It was thin for us, but you know, it all evens out in the end, hopefully. We did accept the federal Sassoon project. We took about 110,000 yards of sand, which we are recycling that sand. We always take the oil refinery projects. And we're about to take the Sacramento project and a few others. We build new capacity every year. So we were building additional capacity this year. So we always have about 1 million yards of capacity when we start every summer season. Next slide. This is for those of you who haven't seen this before. This is what the breach looked like. You know, to breach into an important waterway like Montezuma Slough is a big deal. The approvals and the modeling that we had to do to get the authority to do this, was very complex, but we did it. And in fact, it worked out just so well. I can't even tell you. So this is what was the scene from October 27th, 8 a.m. in 2020. Next slide. The post-breach monitoring results are very, very extensive. Monitoring in all the sloughs, monitoring of the marsh itself, and we participate now in the UC Davis Regional Monitoring Program for fish monitoring. And so we have all kinds of data, more than I'm going to show, but I'll just give you a little highlight. Next slide. So as you know, we're the only site in the region that's allowed to take mildly contaminated material. We basically just used, principles we learned at freshman chemistry at Berkeley, maybe senior chemistry at Stanford. To identify that under geochemical conditions, anaerobic geochemical conditions, where there's no oxygen, that almost all of the metals form sulfide salts, the exception of chromium and arsenic, form sulfide salts with the lowest solubility constants known to man. And so they will not resolubilize, and leaching is just not an issue. And so if you and that's similarly by a different mechanism, if you put organics like PCB, low concentrations of PCBs, or refractory organics like that, which have high partition coefficients, they will attach to soils, and in a non-erosive environment, they will never move. And so we just use these principles to engineer what nature already does with wetlands. Wetlands are nature's way of cleansing the aquatic system. And we just did it at an accelerated basis on steroids, basically. And so it's worked violations. And one of the concerns was, when we open it to the tides, will channels in size or cut into the foundation sediments. And so we did a lot of work on physical modeling and elevations and everything, and it has not at all. We are very thrilled, more than thrilled, that that's the case. We've been doing extensive water quality monitoring. I think we've kept a couple of labs in business. We've done extensive vegetation monitoring, both on the ground and through drones. I'll show you a couple of pictures. We established 30% vegetative cover within 1 year, which was extraordinary. We thought it would take 3 years to do that. I'm an engineer. I'm very conservative anyway. The special status species, the salt marsh harvest mice, have recovered incredibly. I think the last survey, there was 40 something of them that we actually detected, which means there's way more that we did not in phase 1, which was just extraordinary for us. The western pond turtle has come back, and the least tern and snowy plovers, which just came back on their own, have been showing up, and we finally had some young fledglings that made it. So it's a big deal. Those are the most expensive birds in history, I'll have to tell you though. Maybe the condor. Fish were detected immediately after the breach in the site, and the fish abundance and the abundance of native species has been this project. And a year ago, our first steelhead swam into the site, and it's just been so exciting for us. We measure chlorophyll A and zooplankton abundance, and what we're seeing is that our site allows more productivity later in the season than otherwise would be possible. And as you guys know, one of the reasons the fish have been on the ropes, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the big reasons is that the productivity of the system, the zooplankton and the phytoplankton that form the food basis, the food chain for the fish. If you have just deep, narrow channels, like the whole delta was channelized, there's just not that much sunlight that gets down there. The productivity is like 10% of what it really should be. But sites like this can restore that productivity and restore the ability of fish to survive. And we're seeing it happen. And so if I was to die tomorrow I'm not planning on it. I what we did here is going to last forever. And so anyway, I'm just thrilled with what I'm able to tell you today. Next slide. Minute and a half. Okay. Vegetation. Here's a picture. Next slide. All right. Mapping, if you want, we'll send these around later. We do quite a bit of it. Next slide. Shorebird monitoring results. You can see since the breach has been extraordinary. Next slide. We're now moving into phase 2. The agencies have been incredible to work with. And, we do a lot of work through the Bay Area Council, which I'm a leader in, with the governor's office and everybody else and big business, and regulatory agencies suck. And they're driving California into the dirt. I will say that the regulatory agencies in this region who have worked on this reuse, LTMS, everything, have been amazing. They really have. And I tell the governor and I tell these people that's really what it is here. And, but you really have. And they've allowed us to start working on phase 2 and to accelerate some of our permitting. And it's just been great. So we're working on that and we have plenty of capacity available. Next slide. What does the future hold? We do have a concern of whether we can compete against federal and state subsidized sites. And if we can, we will probably be very critical in the recovery of endangered species, fish species. We have about 13 million yards in operating life. And that offloader that you've seen is the best the Bay Area has. And we are open to using it on other projects if folks want to accelerate their project. Next slide. I'm going to just close with the concept that we should use sediment where it's going to have the most benefit. And 2011, the Corps ranked sites based on the potential ecological value. We came in first by a big margin because of our location in the estuary. And I think that while, we all want to support every site that comes into play, and I know Jessica's going to talk about Belmarine Keys, but what I heard is if Belmarine Keys gets approved and gets funded, that the Corps is going to direct all sediment there for 10 years. And I will tell you that it's going to result in, it's not going to be as good for the environment as if at least some material kept coming to Montezuma, because just the ecological values of restoring at Montezuma dwarf those anywhere else in the region. And so I just think we have to be aware of this. And, we don't want to go out of business. We've already demonstrated, we've done so much to demonstrate that we did this. And just to be left on the ropes just to get another site up and running just doesn't make sense to me. So I'm hoping we can collaborate. We've been asking for this with the Corps and the Conservancy, and we've gotten a lot of nodding heads, but nothing of substance. And so we don't want to really have to be in a conflict with that project. So I'm hoping that we can work something out so that we're not forced to defend ourselves to go out of business, and the region doesn't suffer from the benefits that I think our project uniquely provides. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks. Awesome achievements and really great outlook into the future there for Montezuma. And by the way, those principles of sediment chemistry are a prerequisite at Davis. Next speaker is Steve Carroll. He's a supervising engineer for Ducks Unlimited's projects in San Francisco Bay and coastal California. And in addition to being the lead for the design and construction of those projects, he's also responsible for designing and implementing, or has in his on his resume, design and implementation of several fisheries projects, which have really benefited species. So Steve's going to talk about Coleman Ranch, which is an ongoing project, and hopefully a near horizon project at Skaggs Island.
Thank you very much. And I want to also okay, the light was not on. How's that? Okay, thank you very much. I also want to reiterate what Jim said about the urgency. Not only are ecosystems failing, one of the ways our ecosystems are sustainable is by suspended sediment concentrations in the bay, which are on a decline. So our salt marshes primarily accrete through sediments, not through vegetation. And so that's going to make dredge material that much more of an important resource to sustain those in the future. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk briefly about Cullinan and Skaggs Island, both of them located, as you can see on the map, in the north part of San Pablo Bay. They're both part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services San Pablo Bay National Wildlife Refuge. Flex Unlimited has partnered with the Fish and Wildlife to design and implement these restorations. Next slide, please. Cullinan Ranch is a 1,500 site. It's located north of Highway 37, has about 3 miles of highway frontage that we've had to do quite a bit of work to protect that moving in the future for sea level rise. It's located off of Dutchman Slough, and you have to access it through the Napa River, going through Mare Island. We have, go to the next slide. Is it too far away? Okay, I'll do that. So we restored the 1,200 acres of the western side about 2015 in its subsided state. That means we need about 6 feet of sediment accumulation through natural accretion with the tides. We figure it's going to be about 60 years to get there. And our monitoring shows that we're roughly on that target, provided that sediments remain the same as they have been. We did hold back 300 acres of the site for beneficial use. That's to accelerate the marsh development by raising those up around 6 feet. We've been doing that since we restored the rest of it around 2015. We've created 5 containment cells, and the berms that form the containment cells are going to be our future tidal channels. They also provide our water conveyance while we're doing our import operations. We have structures that connect all of our berms to each other, and we have a large structure that allows us to bring in water as needed for management through a fish screen that's connected to our store portion of Cullinan, and we can also decant slurry water if we need to, but we haven't to date. We don't really anticipate that need, but we have that capability. Next slide. So we do not have an offloading facility like Montezuma. So dredgers that bring us material need to set up all the infrastructure that need to put the material into our site. Once there, we take ownership and management responsibility. Material has to be imported hydraulically. We don't bring it in any other way at this point in time. And we do have 2 separate offloading zones that you can set up on. One is on the Napa River confluence. It's about 4,000 feet. It can accommodate much larger scows and equipment, so you can bring in larger quantities at a time. And you can set up within the Dutchman Slough anywhere along the northern border of our site. You're limited by the conditions to maybe a 2,000-yard scow, but you have a much shorter pumping reach to get to our site. And you can see here too that one of our main constraints is we are not located right on the river like Montezuma. We have to come up Napa River, and you have to navigate 2 bridges, which are serious constraints and considerations. Next slide. We've imported about $1.7 million. I'm happy to say that we have recently obtained approval to increase our total quantity from 2.8 million to 4 million, and that's in order to adapt to future sea level conditions. So we're going to be raising the elevation of our final marsh. In addition to that, we are working with the Corps of Engineers and the Coastal Conservancy on the continuing authorizations program. Do I have that right? Authority. Okay. Sorry. Continuing authorities program. And that's hopefully going to be a cost share to bring in about 1 million yards to Cullinan that would otherwise be going to ocean disposal. It's like a 65% federal and 35% non-federal cost share program. It's already gone through the feasibility stage. It's now wrapping up the project management plan stage, and we're getting into the design and hopefully implementation stage. It's been a really fast process. So hopefully that'll be on board before too long. Next slide, please. And this is it's a little busy, but this is our final restoration concept. Once we get all the material into the site, which we're bringing in somewhere around 200,000 to 300,000 a year on average, and we have quite a ways to go to get there. But we're going to wind up constructing additional channels within the marsh plain, and then we're going to deconstruct the berm levees and the perimeter levees and breach to the adjacent sluice system. Next slide, please. Skaggs Island is also located north of Highway 37. It was on hold for quite some time because the Sonoma Land Trust was doing basically a watershed-wide study of Sonoma corridor. And that study has now been completed. And so Skaggs Island is beginning to get back into the design process. We've had some preliminary design concepts, existing conditions done. So we're kind of starting to look at the various options available. Next slide, please. Skaggs Island's got a lot of constraints, and unlike Belmer Keys or Montezuma, it is located in an area that could have serious impacts to adjacent landowners. And there are a lot of private land holdings around Skaggs Island, and the sluice system around it has atrophied and silted in over time. So the concept was to bring in dredged material in order to reduce the tidal prism and minimize the potential for impacts. But as you can see, it's also a very challenging site to get to because you have to go up Sonoma Creek, and that part of San Pablo Bay is very, very shallow. Next slide. This was our original concept. We start out basically by breaking it up into small chunks. We did complete the subsidence reversal portion, which is about 1,000 acres. Skaggs Island's 4,400 acres total. And that is a semi-permanent freshwater wetland that's hoping to at least minimize subsidence, if not reverse it. Skaggs Island also needs around 6 to 7 feet of material across this entire site to get our target marsh plain. And then we were going to construct containment units within Skaggs Island. And then as we got material, we would restore those and move on to subsequent areas. Next slide, please. And this is also from the Sonoma Land Trust, Sonoma Baylands study report. This kind of shows the concept where we would redirect a lot of the tidal energy from Sonoma Creek through Skaggs Island, and it would go into other properties that are being considered for restoration. There's a lot of federal and state properties in hand that are interested in being part of the restoration effort. And there's also some private landowners that are interested in being part of it. We are now looking at trying to do some restoration alternatives that do not include sediment import. And the primary reason is the dilution of having so many different restoration sites that are seeking the material. We don't want the site to sit there and languish for forever. And right now is when we need to have the habitat in place. So we are still open and we'd love to see material come in. It's a 4,000 acre site. That means there's a lot of fetch interior to the site that could erode our levees and impact our neighbors. So we got to address that. But if there's no material, we don't want to sit and wait. Well, all the other sites are kind of fighting over what's out there. There's not that much material dredged in the bay on an annual basis. So with that, thank you for your time. I guess I got one more slide just to let you know that there's a new refuge manager, Melissa Amato, for the San Pablo Bay Refuge, and that's her contact information and mine as well. All right, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Thanks for the information and for covering 2 projects and the time allotted for 1.5 projects. So we'll move on now to Jessica Davenport. Jessica's a deputy program manager for both the State Coastal Conservancy and the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. She's focused her career promoting and funding ecosystem restoration projects in Northern California, and did so previously at the Delta Stewardship Council and at BCDC, where memory serves served a brief stint on the DMMO. And so she's here today to talk about the next phase at Belmer Keys.
Thanks a lot. So again, Jessica Davenport, State Coastal Conservancy. Thanks so much for inviting me to present an update on the Conservancy's work at the Belmer Keys Wetland Restoration Project. I'd like to start with a brief overview of the roles of the Conservancy and the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority in promoting beneficial reuse of dredged sediment, and then update you on Belmer Keys. Next slide. So the Conservancy and the Restoration Authority have contributed significant funding to beneficial reuse. The Conservancy provided 5.5 million to the Army Corps of Engineers for beneficial reuse of the Redwood City Harbor material. The Conservancy is a non-federal sponsor for the San Francisco Bay Strategic Shallow Water Placement Pilot Project at Eden Landing. Although the Corps is covering the full cost for that. The Conservancy is also the non-federal sponsor for the CAP 204 study that Steve just mentioned for Cullinan, paying 35% of that cost, and which is expected to be around 12.3 million total. And then the Restoration Authority has funded Montezuma Wetlands, 1.6 million for the phase 1 completion. And our staff anticipates recommending 2.1 million for the incremental cost of sediment reuse. So you get some subsidies too. And as far as Hamilton, Belmar, and Keys, we're the non-federal sponsor, as well as the landowner and partner with the Corps for restoration. Next slide, please. So let's focus on Belmar and Keys. It's an expansion of the Hamilton project. It's located in the city of Novato between Belmar and Keys community and Novato Creek in the north and Hamilton wetlands to the south. And so this property, combined with the state lands parcel that's leased to the Conservancy, is about 3 times larger than Hamilton at 1,900 acres. Next slide, please. So as you know, the Hamilton Wetlands Restoration Project converted the former Army airfield to approximately 650 acres of tidal marsh seasonal wetlands and uplands. Next slide, please. And it relied on an offloader that was stationed 5 miles offshore in deep water because it is very shallow near the site. It was electrically driven with a power line from Belmar and Keys, and the sediment was slurried with bay water and pumped to the site through a submerged pipe. Next slide, please. In 2000, the Conservancy acquired the Belmar and Keys 5 property, and the conceptual restoration plan is shown here. It includes construction of a new levee substantially inland from the existing bayfront levee, and it'll restore seasonal and tidal wetlands, and also another section of the Bay Trail. And it's expected to result in approximately 900 acres of tidal wetlands, 280 acres of seasonal wetlands, and 400 acres of other types of habitat, including mudflat and uplands. Next slide, please. So in 2019, the Conservancy authorized funding for construction of several features of the restoration plan as a first phase. So this was independent of the Corps. We went forward under an MOU with the Corps to get cost share credit, but we supervised this project of building a new levee, creating the seasonal pond complex over about 90 acres total, but within that there were these 26 acres of seasonal wetlands and 10 acres of enhancement of the alkali meadow, as well as some site drainage modifications, construction of a pump system. Next slide, please. And construction was completed at the end of last year and recently won an award. So great job, team. I wasn't working on it at that time, so I can't take any credit. Next slide, please. So we just received this tentative schedule from our Corps partners, and last month, the Conservancy Board authorized $20 million for the Conservancy to work with the Corps on phase 2 of the project. And so this funding will be applied toward the state's 25% cost share. And once the project cooperation agreement with the Corps is amended, we will work with the Corps to implement the rest of the restoration. And million cubic yards of capacity. And this tentative schedule sets up a couple years of updating the scope and moving toward the final design, a couple more years to complete the plans and specs and obtain the permits and awarding the contract in 2027. But I recently heard that maybe it could go a little faster, and we certainly hope so. We would love to under promise and overperform. So hopefully we can, with all the help of all the people in this room, get this project moving quickly. And hopefully it will be just as successful as Hamilton, which is supporting an amazing array of wildlife, including shorebirds. And it was just out there the other day. I saw an amazing number of black-necked stilts and pelicans. It's just a great site. So thank you. I'll let the next speaker.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, let's hope Belmarine Keys and all the other restoration sites end up as beautiful as Hamilton is now. So our next speaker is Barbara Salzman. Barbara has been a stalwart advocate for environmental conservation since 1974, when she started at the Marin Audubon Society's Conservation Committee, where she's been stridently managing conservation and acquisition and restoration of tidal wetlands throughout her home base of Marin County. So Barbara's here today to talk to us a little more about Tiscornia Marsh.
Okay, hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
sorry if you couldn't hear me.
Okay, no, I couldn't. Okay, yeah, I can. It's hard to believe I've been around that long, but I do remember the early LTMS meetings and meeting with Jim about his project, and it's very rewarding to hear how successful it's been. Of course, I was involved in Belmarine Keys protection also. Our project is a bit different than all of the others, both in size and location and the amount of material that we need. But it's still expensive. So, and it offers many benefits of a different kind in some respects to the others that have been mentioned. So you want to move to the the next slide. First, I want to recognize our partners. As you can see, we're in the middle of a city. And our partners include the city of San Rafael, which is where this project is located at the mouth of the San Rafael Canal. The Multicultural Center of Marin, which is a local organization that serves underserved community residents in the canal area. And ESA is our engineering company, and they do also our environmental reviews and documentation. And thank our funders. The Marin Community Foundation was an early funder, but the Restoration Authority has been a substantial supporter, along with the Coastal Conservancy, and currently we're operating under an Ocean Protection Council grant. Now, our property, we own the marsh. It says Tiscornia Marsh, and 20 acres that extends out into the bay. That's Marin Audubon Society owns that. And so we were given this some years ago, donated. And the project site, which is outlined in red, also includes the diked marsh that is to the west of our property. So that's about 5 acres. They own that diked marsh as well as the levee that goes north-south. As I said, we're in the city of San Rafael, so we have to deal with a lot of other issues that it doesn't sound so much like the other projects have had to deal with. But we have significant benefits. To the local community, and it's the most economically and culturally diverse area in the county. So we're very happy to be able to provide them benefits. As you can see, we're right in the middle of an urban area. To the left to the west is residential. To the south is the San Rafael Community Center, as well as residential and some commercial. To the east is the bay and mud flat that is part of Marin Audubon's property. And to the north is the San Rafael Canal. the problems that we have and what got us interested in doing this project is the fact that the marsh itself has a tidal marsh has eroded by 1/3 in the last 30 years. So if this project were not done to restore this marsh, it would be mostly gone in 30 years from now. So we thought it was terribly important to be able to restore the marsh. Along with that, we had the opportunity through the city's willingness to restore the diked marsh to tidal action. So that will be part of the project. And the levees are in bad shape. Their portions of them are low, heavily eroded, and anyway, they present a flood risk to the local community. So our project is designed to raise the levee to a uniform height of about 13 feet and to create an ecotone transition zone for habitat as well as levee stability. We want to restore the tidal marsh to the extent that it was in 1950. And that will be done by constructing a coarse beach, which is the yellow section, and importing sediments to fill in basically the marsh to restore the tidal marsh. Also, we'll be removing an outer levee and bringing it further into to expose and allow the restoration of the diked marsh, and the levee will be pulled up against the soccer field, which is a part of the community center park. The sediment amount that we will need. Oh, I forgot to mention also, how could I have forgotten this, that this marsh or tidal marsh, even though it's tiny compared to many others that you're talking about today, has been habitat for clapper rails or ridgeway rails, as they're called now, for a number of years. Some years they're absent, but they've been there this year, and they've been recorded in many other years. So we'll be a major biological benefit will be restoring the habitat for ridgeway rails. And so we need, and the Bay Trail will be constructed on top of the new levee, which will be pulled in a little bit. So we need about 30,000 cubic yards, which is minuscule compared to what everybody else here needs. But I think I'd like to say that I think that there's probably many other sites like ours around where you get significant public benefits of flood control, as biological benefits, and economic benefits also. The location where we hope to get the material is along the canal. There's a lot of dredging that's going on. It's going on right now, apparently, but there's the Corps dredges, or has in the past, they will be this year, dredging the channel. There's 2 marinas that are potential sources, as well as a private individual dredging, people that have their own boat docks that dredge with, I guess Scott manages a lot of that project. And then there's one that's a little bit offshore, down further along the shoreline, which is Loch Lomond Marina. That's also an opportunity. And the Bridge District is also, they're all except for Loch Lomond, I don't know about them, they're all dredging right now. So we're hoping by the time we are ready to import dredge material, we'll be able to take advantage of subsequent dredging with them. Now, we were asked to speak to what we've been doing since the last time, and you can move to the next slide now. So I'm going to move to the next slide. Yeah. Yeah, so this shows a bunch of other projects that are going on. Being in the middle of an urban area, we have a lot of other things going on that we have had to deal with as part of our project. One is that the soccer field improvements the city is planning has required some coordination in terms of the exact location of the changed levee location. The city also has a project on the south side to improve parking. So there'll be new parking spaces going in, and that also abuts our project site, so, or our property too. So we have to, we've been addressing that with the city. The city also has a trash capture facility off to the west there that also overlaps with our footprint. And so we've been working with them about integrating that into our levee design. There are 2 PG&E poles that are not clearly marked here, but one is out in the marsh and one is out, actually it's been exposed with the eroded tidal marsh. So it's been difficult, but we've been dealing with, working with PG&E, and we're hopeful to work something out so that in the future we will not have to have the marsh bisected by their walkways. So currently there are like 3 walkways that go into it from the current levee, which we're removing, out to their towers. So we're still working that out. And basically we've had since the last time we've been here, we've had 5 meetings with the Brit. And we're trying to work to get our permits submitted, or our application submitted by the end of this month. Our schedule is that we have 2023 anticipated for raising the levees, 2024 for building the containment. That may have to sit for a year, but so that means that either our tidal marsh restoration will be 2024, 25, and then we have to put another lift on the levee and surface the levee and put in other park improvements. So basically that's our project. And I would expect there's others around that are similar, that small, that would give flood control as well as other biological benefits around the bay. We were also
Barbara, I'm going to have to stop you there. I pardon the interruption, but we are running short on time, and it may be 30 more seconds.
Oh, I just wanted to give you my thoughts on what to do about the sediments. I think that the LTMS needs to increase the amount to go to beneficial uses and not allow so much or any to go to the ocean. The agencies should condition permits so that the sediments can go to beneficial reuse rather than, I understand in the past, they've been directed to a specific location. And I think that you should revise the LTMS goals of 2040 40 that were appropriate at that time, but not anymore. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I appreciate the brevity at the end there. But you hit on a lot of key points with your, not just your project, but your questions there at the end. So speaking of questions, we're not going to have time for any. The ones that I see in the chat, I think can be answered through BPC. And I think a lot of questions will probably be answered with our next panel. Okay, thank you so much, everybody.
Cameron, can you hear me? Yes, no? Light is red. Red light is good. Okay. Thank you, everybody. This is our third panel. We are testing out the hybrid model. It is a work in progress, but I think we're learning a lot. There are a lot of lessons being learned right now. Speaking of lessons being learned, I am joined by one engineer, one scientist, and one policy wonk. So this is very exciting. So we're going to get a lot of different perspectives here. So if anybody takes umbrage with that description, please let me know. But we are going to start with our engineer, and not me, engineer. We're starting with Stu Townsley. Stu Townsley is a deputy district engineer for project management for the San Francisco district, or the core. The way I typically introduce Stu in public is that he is the head civilian of the San Francisco district. As many of you know, speaking of hybrid, the Army Corps of Engineers is an organization that has a strong military presence, but also a strong civilian presence. And they are very different, but they found a way to work together, just like the dredging community. So without further ado, Stu Townsley.
All right, is this on? Okay, red is good. It's counterintuitive for engineers. What I was asked to talk about, and they came up, how to get more dredge materials is really what was posed to me. And I just want to first acknowledge that the Corps of Engineers is a big black bureaucratic box. Okay, and it's really hard to understand, even for those of us who've worked for them for 20 years, all the nuances of policy and law and how they all roll up. The other thing I want to mention at the beginning is whatever we do for local implementation in San Francisco Bay needs to fit in the context of national policy. And the easy way to describe that is the San Francisco district gets somewhere around $60 million to run its dredging program. Nationally, that's over $1 billion. So we're just a small percentage of it. And so the consistency nationally is a huge driver in the way the Corps of Engineers implements policy through WRDA or things like that. You can pop to the next slide. So I kind of rephrased this as what I anticipated the right question to be, which is how do we minimize deep ocean disposal at SF Dodd San Francisco Deep Ocean Disposal Site, and how can we maximize beneficial use? But there's a series of constraints that we operate under, and the first is the federal basically says we must use the least cost, environmentally practicable method to dredge. That's law, that's not policy. Okay, and there's a big distinction when stuff gets embedded into the Code of Federal Regulations in terms of agency discretion. We can reinterpret our policies, and we often do, especially with congressional direction, but we cannot reinterpret the law. Second is we have a dredging window in the bay that is largely June through November. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. I want to talk dredging equipment. Mostly we use clamshell in the bay. We'd have one hopper that we use a year. And then in the Delta, we use cutter heads and pipelines, which is interesting to me. And I'll talk about that in a subsequent slide. And then the logistics issue of beneficial use is interesting. And I sort of pulled my punch on this one. But we really right now couple the dredging program with the movement of material to beneficial use locations. And that has a finally, just as a point of order, WRDA is an authorizing bill. It's not an appropriations bill. And so the Corps of Engineers, I'm not even looking at my own. There you go. Thank you. So WRDA is an authority bill, not an appropriations bill. And the Corps of Engineers is a project funded organization. Congress specifically appropriates money to do a very specific task. And so what we get is a lot of things through WRDA bills that express congressional desire around policy, but we don't get oftentimes pairing appropriations. And so that's, if you're going to start poking into our black box, you need to understand that that appropriation is a really critical component to our project execution. Now you can go to the next slide. San Francisco Bay is the most expensive dredging market in the United States. And bluntly, for more dredge material to be used beneficially, we're going to have to either find ways for cost reduction, or we're going to have to find cost share partners. And what I mean by that, and really I'll get to the DMMP mentioned in the first panel, which is a regional dredge material management plan, is a way that we can look and propose alternatives to actually delivering dredging, and we're going to step into it in a big way with our regional DMMP. We're going to look at it as a program in addition to as a project. And there's some advantages to that. Remember, we're a project, but if we can approach dredge material management from a programmatic bay-wide approach, we may be able to find cost efficiencies that allow us to actually deliver under the federal standard more material for beneficial use. We may. Now, our ability to do so runs through a bunch of other agencies too, because we have to and then finally, vis-a-vis cost sharing, the cost share model that the Corps of Engineers uses nationally is the local partner will pay the increment of cost above the federal standard. Now I'm going to put a big asterisk on that comment, because the other way is the way that Ocean Beach, Cullinan 204, and Belmarin Keys are doing it, which is get a federal project, which then becomes the vehicle to do a different cost share than the full incremental cost above federal standard. I want that to be very clear, as we put a bunch of material last year on Ocean Beach with the San Francisco PUC as our cost share partner. They paid 35%. The federal government paid 65% of that incremental cost share. And Belmarin Keys gets to be even more fun because it's an old authority that has a 75-25 cost share. So it's really a good value to local tax. Next slide. So dredging windows. Dredge equipment is extraordinarily expensive, and the labor that runs it is expensive. When we have windows and we can only utilize that equipment partially during the year, we end up paying an amortization cost to industry to have that equipment available in our short window. That's expensive. And it's expensive on the West Coast, which is a relatively small market as compared to Gulf Coast and South Atlantic coast for the Corps of Engineers. Once a dredging company moves equipment through the Panama Canal to the Gulf Coast, they can find a fair amount of work there, but getting equipment is extraordinarily expensive, and we pay for it, the Corps of Engineers and federal taxpayers, in mobilization and demobilization costs. So really, to my mind, one of the goals that we should be looking at is how can we help industry increase the utilization of equipment in San Francisco Bay as a mechanism to help reduce costs. And then I note with a little bit of irony that the current regulations that we operate under allow us to dredge outside of that window if we're beneficially using it. So my question, that just sort of rhetorical, is if the window is all that important, then why do we get the benefit of beneficial use side of the window? And so I think we need to start thinking long-term about how we're going to approach that. I also note that South Atlantic Division, which does the bulk of that Gulf Coast dredging, Atlantic coast in there, worked extensively with NOAA to open up and remove dredging windows that were largely based on turtles. And what we came to, the Corps of Engineers, South Atlantic Division, and the regulatory resource agencies came to an agreement about methodology, about timing, and about impacts, which has allowed that market to function with a much broader time window, further reducing costs. Next slide, please. So we use mostly clamshell in the bay and cutterhead and pipeline in the Delta. And I guess I'm a little confused because the only distinction I can tell between the two is a geographic boundary between the San Francisco Regional Water Quality Board and the Delta Regional Water Quality Board, and the NOAA offices in Santa Rosa versus the NOAA offices in Sacramento. I'm not a fisheries guy, but for me, it's like really interesting that all of a sudden we reach some magic line and all of, and we're directed to use different equipment. There may be more to it. I don't know, but I think it's a question we should very clearly ask and answer in a public environment. We mostly dredge in the bay, which is a clamshell to scow to a pump out when we beneficially use material. It's the most expensive, period. The most expensive way of getting beneficial use done. Many locations across the country that are beneficially using material have less than half the cost that we have in San Francisco Bay. Less than half the cost. Next slide. And then logistics. And I'm going to throw this out there. And I know we looked at this collectively some time ago and said, no, we don't want to do this. But aquatic transfer sites offer an awful lot of opportunity. And what that means is we would designate an area material could be placed, and then when a receiving site is ready for that material, they can go collect it. And what that means is I can decouple the actual dredging contract and the dredging episode from the utilization of material. And where that really matters is exemplified by the challenge we have currently with the Napa River dredging project, where the sponsor provided placement site is unable to accept any more material right now as they wait for it to decant. So we're stopping, we're paying, the federal government is paying for standby dredging because we didn't fully deliver a site to them that was available for their planned dredging. That's expensive. An aquatic transfer may help. Steve, I was very happy to hear you say suspended sediment is important. May help really answer some of the cost issues that we have. And then this gets to, with that, we may be able to think more thoughtfully about when we would like to dredge and when we would like to beneficially pick up that material and place it, which should increase equipment utilization and may drive some cost differences. It also may offer an opportunity to reset the base cost, which is the federal standard. So just something to think about. Next slide. This is the final one. These are some solutions. I guess the first thing is I hope we all recognize that we will never restore San Francisco Bay to pre-European conditions under sea level rise. We need to think about what we want our future to look like, not how we get back to 1830. That means we need to do things differently. I would also say that, our regulatory program, and I'm a legitimate multiple personality disorder guy. I have a regulatory program that I got to run, and I got an implementation program I got to run. So I see both sides of the equation, but the laws and the policies that govern regulatory environments are, you need a project proposal before they step in. And what that does is it discourages my agency, and I believe it discourages other agencies from being able to take bold steps about a Bay-wide solution for the future. Now, that's not to say BCDC isn't doing things to update their plan or stuff like that. But where the rubber meets the road is the actual implementation of project work as opposed to planning documents. And we need to think about that. Additionally, I think we need to continually improve our science. And Melissa Foley will be next up on talking a little bit about the science. But I don't think we have all the answers on the science around dredging and around impact. We might place material, thin layer placement, near shore placement. Obviously, putting it right where you want is going to be very effective, but it's also extraordinarily expensive. Can we find other ways where we can achieve some positive at a much reduced cost? I didn't put this in here, but one of the things I've noted over the course of my tenure in this job is the huge discussion, which is always wrapped in other dialogue, ultimately comes down to who pays. It's not that we don't have good ideas, but it really is how do you go through and identify who the bill payer is to achieve those good ideas? And so keep that in mind as you start thinking about what we need to do collectively in the Bay. And then I just want to, we need to do it now. We need to start thinking differently. We need to start taking proactive steps to be able to address what I consider to be a looming crisis, not only from an ecosystem standpoint, health standpoint, but also from standing around the Bay. And with that, thank you. Do I turn this off now, or do I have to be really quiet?
I think I'm back on, right? All right. Stu, that was great. So I actually got so excited that I never really introduced what the panel topic was. So as Stu correctly, or myself for that matter, I'm Jan Novak. I'm the third member, third lead of the dredging committee here at BPC. The topic we have before us is how to get more dredge material. And I think that has been something that's been brought up. It's a common theme that's been moving through all panels. So I'm moving to our scientist, Melissa Foley from the San Francisco Estuary Institute. She is the managing director of the San Francisco Bay Regional Monitoring Program, and she's going to be talking about the science of how to get more dredge material to our sites.
Great, thank you, Jan. And yeah, thanks for having me today. So Stu set me up really well. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the science that's being done to inform beneficial reuse in the Bay Area. Next slide. So Scott Dusterhoff was here last year for this workshop and communicated from their Sediment for Survival report that by the end of the century, San Francisco Bay will need about 450 million cubic yards to support the marshes and mudflats that we have now, as well as those that we are planning on restoring. So that's a lot of sediment over the next 75 years or so. Next slide. And the fortunate good news is that we have about a third of that sediment that we need is coming from, sort of the current landscape as well as management approaches. So natural deposition on the marshes and mudflats, as well as, a lot of the projects that have been talked about today in that dredge sediment and putting those in those subsided areas or polders. But that means that we need to change some things in order to get the other 2/3 of that sediment. So These include things like increasing, you can go back to the previous slide, upland excavated sediment, reservoir sediment, as well as additional dredge sediment to these beneficial use projects. Next slide. So the science that I'll talk about today is really in the vein of trying to support a range of methods for beneficial reuse from direct to strategic placement. And there's really a spectrum of methods within these two different categories, including things like a polder filling, which has mainly been done in the bay, thin layer placement, which is being tried, and then in strategic placement, like nearshore placement or water column seeding are a couple of methods there. Next slide. So in the Bay Area, we've come a long way in using dredge sediment for beneficial reuse, and there are still many questions that remain. Particularly these questions, there's a need to facilitate regional coordination on future projects, need to understand sediment transport dynamics, as well as ecosystem effects, particularly from strategic placement methods, as well as a way to calculate the benefits to the region of beneficially reusing dredge sediment rather than taking it to the ocean. Next slide. So there's a lot of science happening in the Bay Area attempting to answer these questions. And I am going to highlight work being done for two efforts. The first is the Regional Monitoring Program for Water Quality in San Francisco Bay, or the Bay RMP. And then work that SFEI has been doing in collaboration with the Army Corps on the RDMMP. Next slide. So I'll start with the work that's being done within the RMP. The first around sediment guidelines. The Bay RMP uses monitoring data from sediment in the deep bay as well as in the margin areas to inform and update sediment guidelines for using dredge material for beneficial reuse for 7 different contaminants. In another project, we invited an expert panel to review the current sediment guidelines for the Bay and to provide some recommendations on potential revisions to that process and those guidelines. And then we're just finishing up an alternative analysis using an alternate method to derive sediment thresholds and compare that method to the existing one. Next slide. Secondly, the RMP provides database support. I think Jen mentioned earlier the DMMO database. The RMP maintains that database as well as improves the database over time. And what this allows for is in-depth analyses of dredging data to evaluate the testing requirements. And I'm also listing sediment here as well. The RMP doesn't directly support this, but it is an important database and web interface that allows that matching to occur potentially between sediment that's available and opportunities for beneficial reuse. Next slide. And then on the topic of sediment transport, we are developing a sediment conceptual model that focuses on sediment transport into the bay from the watersheds between sub-embayments, as well as from the bay to the marshes. Could you advance to the next slide? Thanks, perfect. We are also funding monitoring studies at 3 locations within the bay, looking at sediment transport from the bay onto the marsh surface and understanding the conditions under which sediment is being transported. We have a project, multiple projects actually looking at watershed sediment loading, monitoring into the bay, as well as a regional model that's in development, looking at sediment and contaminant transport to the bay from the watersheds. And then we're also just beginning some work on a sediment transport model for the bay that will primarily focus on transport within the water column, as well as eventually modeling transport of sediment from the shallows onto the marsh surface. Next slide. So the RDMMP that Stu just talked about SFEI conducted a gaps analysis that was focused on the science around, what we really need to know in order to advance beneficial reuse. And with the help of an interagency work group, we prioritized those gaps. I'm also going to list here some of the efforts from the Strategic Shallow Water Placement Pilot Project, or the 1122 project, that's being led by Julie Beagle, because these two projects are really complementary in terms of the work that's being done there. So the first one that I wanted to highlight is a regional analysis. This will be led by Jeremy Lowe at SFEI. And the goal here is really to come up with a set of essentially priorities of where beneficial reuse sediment is needed, identify how much is needed, and where is it likely to be most feasible and effective in the Bay. And the outcomes, the output from that effort will be some regional maps and a narrative highlighting key locations for beneficial reuse. Next slide. More sediment transport work here with these two efforts within the core. And the efforts here are really focused on understanding what is the fate of placed sediment, particularly for that nearshore placement project, and what transport processes are most important. So different projects happening here for the 1122 project, focused sediment transport modeling on key locations. That was done to really prioritize where this 1122 pilot would occur. There will also be post-project monitoring of sediment transport once that sediment is placed. And then for the RDMMP effort, a project is just getting underway, doing expanded sediment transport modeling. And this will be linked to the regional analysis if all goes well, so that modeling is really focused on those priority locations. Next slide. Additional work happening within this core effort is looking at the ecosystem effects. So for the 1122 project, there will be before and after monitoring, again, of sediment, but also of those benthic habitats to understand what are the effects. As well as for the RDMMP, there will be, next slide, there will be ecosystem effects modeling at those key sites. And this ecosystem model is connected to the sediment transport model. So kind of building on all of these different projects of the regional analysis, sediment transport, and ecosystem effects. Next slide. And then the final component that I wanted to touch on is one of the areas that was identified by the interagency work group as one of the most important to advance is this developing a method to assess the benefits and trade-offs associated with beneficial reuse. And many folks have brought it up today, what are the ecosystem and the social benefits associated with beneficial reuse, and particularly what are those benefits compared to business as usual or no action. Next slide. So beneficial reuse today in the Bay Area has really been focused on the method of direct placement. And to date, around 28 million cubic yards of dredged sediment have been used to restore over 7,500 acres of wetland. And this is a really critical role for dredged sediment and is a method for using a lot of dredged sediment. So we know that there's still capacity at Montezuma and Cullinan. Belmarine Keys 5 should be coming online in the next 5 to 6 years. And then Skaggs and Tiscornia, again, in that planning stage, so online sometime in the future. But beyond that, there are not a lot of sites that have started this planning process. And so our ability to, sort of use a lot of dredged sediment in these big projects will hopefully not falter over time. And hopefully that regional analysis can help with that, sort of prioritization and get these projects moving. Next slide. But as sea levels continue to rise, the need to restore marshes in using direct placement will continue, and the need to help existing marshes keep pace with sea level rise is likely to increase, necessitating the addition of strategic placement methods. Some marshes are already starting to drown today, but by 2050, that number will be much larger. And 2050, may sound like a long time from now, but it's going to take time to pilot these different strategic placement methodologies, different direct placement methodologies, to really understand where these different methods are effective, where they're cost efficient, and what the effects and benefits of these methods are. So we really do need to start now and be thinking about creatively about these different methods so that we have a diverse toolbox of approaches to mitigate the effects of sea level rise. Next slide. And I just want to highlight that the dredging community isn't solely responsible for mitigating the effects of sea level rise on bayland habitats. Dredged sediment is just one leg of a stool for mitigating the effects of sea level rise on marshes and mudflats. But it's a tool that we can use now and into the future to ensure healthy and resilient baylands. And to do that, we need to work together as a region and think about creative solutions to this complex problem. Next slide. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Melissa. That was great. So we've heard now from our engineer on how to make the logistics more efficient. We've heard from our science how to improve placement. We're to hear from Sonia Petek from the California Legislative Analyst's Office. I'd like to point out that Sonia is stepping very much outside of her comfort zone to be here. She doesn't typically deal with dredge material. And last year, her predecessor, Rachel Ehlers, did the same thing to come. And I hope she's learning a little bit today about what we process that we all kind of take for granted here. But we're deeply grateful that she's joining us. She is the principal fiscal and she can maybe explain her job a little bit better than I can, but she deals with water systems, water quality, flood control, and the Delta area. So without further ado.
Thank you, Jan. And this is working okay? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, I've learned a lot today. Thank you for having me. Yes, I do cover water policy, coastal bay and delta issues, fish and wildlife, and I cover the relevant state departments that are concerned with those issues. But further, Jan's initial statement is that although I've been at the Legislative Analyst's Office for 6 years, I am new to this area of water policy and fish and wildlife. I was actually in the Health and Human Services area covering public health during the pandemic and as well as developmental disabilities services. So this is quite a shift for me, but I'll tell you what our office does, and then it might make sense why somebody could transition to an entirely new topic area. So the LAO Legislative Analyst's Office was founded in 1941. We serve as an independent and nonpartisan fiscal and policy advisor to the state legislature. And historically, one of our most important responsibilities has been to analyze the annual governor's budget. In recent years, this means that our office has presented a series of analyses from beginning to end of the budget process on overarching fiscal issues, as well as specific departmental proposals. And we offer recommendations for the legislature as they craft their own budget. Legislature may or may not take those recommendations. You might also know the LAO from the voter information guide. We do all of the impartial analyses of statewide ballot propositions. So that may be where you're most familiar with us. So for the talk today, I'm going to, compared to the other speakers, take sort of a step further back to talk about some of the significant efforts underway at the state level to address climate change and to build resilience, which includes addressing sea level rise, particularly through nature-based solutions. So if you advance to the next slide. I will first talk about some of the funding that's been included in recent state budgets, then go over some of the recent legislation that's passed, and then talk about some of the various multi-agency sort of strategic, including the recent state agency sea level rise action plan. You can move to the next. Thank you. So this is the funding that this is highly detailed, but I want you to just pay attention to that number in the bottom right corner. These are in millions of dollars. So in the 21-22 budget, which was passed last June of 2021, more than $13 billion was approved in the state budget for spending over 3 years to address climate related goals, or to address water and drought, zero emission vehicles, climate resilience, wildfire and forest health, and renewable energy. And I would note within the climate resilience category, the budget set aside some funding for nature-based solutions in subsequent years for ocean protection and sea level rise. If you move to the next. So the budget that was just passed this summer, it passed in June, but there were just been finalized. There was an additional $16 billion. Some of the money was actually scored for reasons I don't need to get into right now, but some of the money was scored to 21-22. So this is funding that will go through the current fiscal year 22-23, as well as the next fiscal year 23-24. And what I want to note here is that almost all of this funding is on top of the funding that was approved in last year's budget. So we're talking really significant investments. So again, we've got funding for energy. This is, you may be curious to know, this includes the Yellow Canyon Power Plant, funding for zero emission vehicles, drought response and resilience, wildfire and forest resilience, okay. yeah. Got to pretend I'm like a singer or something. Okay. So for nature-based solutions, I'll discuss this in a couple slides, but I just want to note that some of this funding was actually included in the previous slide. So only that row includes some of the funding from the previous slide because it was sort of a set aside that was included in last year's budget for funding this year and the following year. And then it was sort of allocated to specific departments in this year's budget. Funding in both 23 and 24, as well as in some of the out years. But that funding will be subject to legislation. But it's the intent is to include that funding. You can advance to the next slide, please. You obviously can read this, or actually maybe go through this one and go to the next one and then one more. If the slides are shared, you can take a closer look at that. I was just trying to, so when the governor and legislature agreed on the budgets for the last 2 years, they sort of sliced and diced it in a number of ways and included things under like within these various packages and under these various umbrella categories. Gets a little confusing, like which money is for what. But the bottom line really is what I want to show you on this slide, which is the funding approved in both years for specifically for sea level rise and coastal protection, funded Conservancy and Ocean Protection Council. So this includes nearly $600 million in 22-23, the current budget year, as well as more about $650 million in 23-24. And one thing to note in the current year funding is that the budget bill language specifies that 30 million of that should be for Bay Area projects that use nature-based solutions to address sea level rise and should be allocated through the State Coastal Conservancy's Climate Ready program. And this funding will be available for expenditure until June 30th, 2025. You can advance to the next slide. This just presents some of the language. So as you can imagine, these are significant levels of funding being given to various state departments to address some of these big goals. And of course, implementation, the devil's in the details, but I just wanted to point out that the various statutes associated with the state budget includes some language. This money should be spent at a very high level. So, projects the funding for project rise should protect coastal ecosystems and coastal watersheds, and can be used for projects that are consistent with the San Francisco Bay Area Restoration Authority Act. You can move to the next slide. I also just wanted to note some relevant legislation that's passed in 2021 and 2022. AB 72 from last year concerns coastal adaptation project permitting. A more coordinated and efficient regulatory review and permitting process for coastal adaptation project infrastructure. So this will require the Natural Resources Agency to submit by July 1st, 2023, a report to the legislature with suggestions and recommendations for how to improve and expedite that coordination. As I sort of noted in the overview of it, it specifies that coastal adaptation projects can include sort of the natural infrastructure or soft strategies as opposed to just hard structures. Senate Bill 1 that also passed last year concerns sea level rise planning. One thing I wanted to note to you all is that this really directs the California Coastal Commission to incorporate sea level rise in all of its planning, development, and mitigation efforts. Next slide, please. So this year, I wanted to highlight 3 pieces of legislation that passed. The first, SB 850 resilience districts. And what this really means is that it allows cities, counties, and special districts to increase property taxes to fund climate resilience projects. So this is pretty significant in that it allows locals to sort of create funding for climate resilience projects. And it gives one provision of the law is that it requires entities to give priority to projects that utilize natural infrastructure. AB 1902 created or included amendments on the law concerning resource conservation districts. And you probably all know better than I do, but resource conservation districts were created in the 30s in response to the Dust Bowl, but hadn't really been significantly updated since the 70s. So the language now has amended the code to state that these districts could be formed to pursue projects related to climate resilience, including those related to sea level rise. And then finally, AB 1384 set out some new requirements for the state's climate adaptation strategy. This isn't necessarily specific to sea level rise. It's just that it requires the state's climate adaptation strategy, which is now called Safeguarding California Strategy. It has to be updated every 3 years with a new plan completed by January 2024. If you move to the next slide. I also just wanted to note that in February, the Ocean Protection Council released this multi-agency sea level rise action plan. That's based on 7 sea level rise principles that were developed in 2020. And both of these, the principles as well as this plan, reflect a collaboration between the Natural Resources Agency, Cal EPA, and over 15 other departments and agencies. And one of the principles is around local support for various projects and strategies. And within that, there's a key action included, key action 5.15, which addresses regulatory and financial barriers related to the reuse of sediment and soil through a policy amendment to the Bay Plan. So this, Steve from BCDC already went over sort of the BCDC's current plan for addressing that amendment and the EPA grant that will help fund that, along with the state funding from the Ocean Protection Council. I'd also just note, there have been numerous other sort of planning and strategic documents and guidelines issued in recent years, and I'm happy to, if you reach out to me, if you don't have them already, I've got links to all of them. But these include, for example, the Strategic Plan to Protect California's Coast and Ocean from 2020 to 2025, the Ocean Protection Council's Sea Level Rise Guidance, and the Cutting the Green Tape Initiative. So if you move to the final slide, I just note some key takeaways. I hope that I've demonstrated to you that climate resilience and response and adaptation has been really a significant issue for the governor and legislature in the past couple of years, and they've dedicated significant amount of funding to address these issues, including sea level rise and coastal protection. Some of the funding does respond to emergency conditions, but some of it's for longer term projects, and the funding is allowed to be spent over several years. It doesn't all have to be spent, for example, in the current budget year. Many of these projects are still in the planning phase. I know that a lot of the funding to address sea level rise that goes through the Coastal Commission and maybe the Coastal Conservancy, and maybe our colleague Jessica from the Conservancy knows more about this, but a lot of that funding goes through their Climate Ready program, which provides grants for projects in various phases. And I just was looking at the site this morning, and up through about 2021, the Climate Ready program had granted about 12 million in projects. So the significant additional funding, like in the hundreds of millions, is going to be quite a huge investment and change and opportunity. Okay, we already talked about significant state funding available, but it also, there's, as I've noted throughout, there's a big focus on nature-based solutions, but also on sort of interagency coordination and collaboration, which I've been sort of impressed listening to the talks today about the amount of coordination that's already going on in the Bay Area. And just to close, obviously, state and local partnerships will be very essential. Many of the goals and objectives laid out by the state will require local buy-in. So I'll just end with this question, which I think my colleague last year had also ended with, which is how can the state support and encourage effective local action? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and to all of our panelists. I believe we have about 5 minutes left for questions. So let me see what we have in the Q&A. Oh, Melissa's already preemptively answered some of the questions in the Q&A online. One question, anonymous attendee asks, if dredging is so expensive, why not focus on qualifying material from construction export projects within the Bay Area, which generate potential BRM all year long?
So the most expensive beneficial reuse of material through dredging runs in the low $30 a cubic yard. Corps of Engineers is paying about $100 a cubic yard to truck in material for our shoreline project at the south end of the bay. So as expensive as dredging is, it is still far cheaper than basically trucking it in. And then the trucking also will trigger all kinds of air quality and traffic issues that you've got to deal with in already crowded areas. Hope that answers the question.
One question. This one's also for you, Stu. If a dredging project is being done next to an area requesting beneficial reuse material, for example, like San Rafael, how can that be more expensive than hauling dredge material into the core bay or ocean, deep ocean?
It isn't. But we don't have very many dredging channels immediately adjacent to locations where we can put material. And so that's one of the things that we hope comes out of the SFEI report, is to identify locations that are much closer to the dredging. There is a caveat to that. The bay is extraordinarily shallow in most of it, and much of the equipment that we use to dredge require drafts that won't allow that same equipment to work in very shallow water that's adjacent to potential restoration sites that would use beneficial material. So it's the logistics of actually marrying up the dredging and the placement are extraordinarily complex for most sites.
Excellent. And I believe that just about wraps up this session. So thank you very much to our panelists for two present and one virtual. So thank you very much. All right. And we're in an effort to maximize time and to get us out promptly, which is a BPC priority. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Todd Bridges, also with the Army Corps of Engineers. Seen Dr. Bridges speak several times. He runs a program at the Army Corps called Engineering with Nature, which is looking at ways to combine core projects with nature-based solutions. So without further ado, Dr. Bridges.
Listen first. Am I not? Okay. Yeah. Yep. Thank you for the invitation. I've found this morning very productive. I've got 5 pages of my own notes, some of which I'll share with you now and some of which I won't because it might be too explosive for me to share them. Maybe I'll just give you my bottom line up front while Cameron brings up my slides, hopefully. But first is, you're not alone. The stories, sometimes we overemphasize uniqueness. There's little unique in your problem set here, let me tell you. I mean, the stories and the challenges that you have here are repeated all across the country. Whether you're talking about, dredging in the Great Lakes or in the Gulf or the South Atlantic or wherever it happens to be. Scales might be different, but the challenges are exactly the same. Okay, nothing unique about San Francisco Bay in that respect. And I guess my bottom line recommendation to you is to encourage you to frame, if you want to make progress on beneficial use, to frame everything you do on the economics of sediment management. And what I mean by that is both sides of the economics, the costs and the benefits. That is the key to you making progress. And hopefully I can substantiate that somewhat for you here. That's not to say the science is not important, but the science needs to be framed by the economics of sediment management. Okay, so innovating for a more resilient and sustainable San Francisco Bay. Go ahead, Cameron, next slide. 3 years ago, I traveled with the Corps' director of civil works at the time, James Dalton, our executive who manages the entirety of the civil works program of the Corps. I traveled with James to Hobart, Tasmania, on the other side of the globe, to attend an Australasian coastal engineering conference. And just as James took the podium to give the keynote address for this conference, my wife texts me from the other side of the globe to tell me that our 5-year-old granddaughter was being wheeled into the surgical room for an emergency appendectomy. And I took this picture of James, right before I got that text. And I probably don't have to convince you very much that I had a little trouble concentrating on James's, speech that morning. But, and that's her there. She lives actually in San Jose. I just got to spend some time with her this weekend. But if you go to the next slide, it did cause me to think about a lot of things. So as my mind roamed a lot during James's remarks, I was convincing myself that it was all in hand, with the surgeons. And I was reflecting upon the truly revolutionary advancements that have been made in medicine in my lifetime. When I was born, basically, heart surgery of any variety was brand new. And when you consider how routine that is today, it's mind-boggling. But you could just look at the transformation, the innovation that has occurred in medicine in the last 50 years or so. It is mind-boggling to consider. Now, the question that I'm posing here on the right is, if we had to create a list of innovations in the field of civil engineering or environmental engineering or environmental management, what would that list look like by comparison to medicine? I'm not sure what would be on your list, but I would suggest to you it would look paltry by comparison. And why is that? I mean, I'm not going to get into that. I have my hypotheses about this, but we need more innovation in civil and environmental engineering. And our country's future really depends, and the future of San Francisco Bay depends on that happening. Okay, next slide. So, and if you look at the history of civil engineering, if you will, in the country in the 20th century, this is what it looks like. That's what we built. It was a bunch of stuff. And we used a bunch of concrete and rock to do that, and steel. And in fact, a paper was published about 2 years ago in the journal Nature that established 2020 as a milestone on planet Earth, where the amount of human-produced mass in the form largely of infrastructure construction materials, concrete, rock, steel, asphalt, the amount of human-produced mass in the form of those materials now exceeds the total living biomass at more than 1 teraton. That's 10 to the 12th metric tons. And the curve that's on that slide there it shows you the growth of that production in the 20th century. The doubling rate of human-made mass on the planet is 20 years. Every 20 years, it doubles. And that graph really challenges the notion of sustainability, I would submit to you. I mean, where do we stop when the entire surface of the planet is covered with concrete and asphalt? I mean, that's what the curve suggests maybe the final outcome is. So when we think about the future, whether it's San Francisco Bay or any other place, what are our solutions going to look like? Okay, next slide. And I'm actually was born and raised in California. I'm from Clovis, California, in the heart of the San Joaquin Valley. And the story of California is a rich one in many respects, including how much engineering has transformed the landscape of California. It doesn't compare to any other spot in the country, probably on the globe, actually. There's been a lot of human intervention in the landscape of California, and the San Joaquin Valley is just one of those that lessons can be drawn from. But for the sake of time, I could tell lots of stories there, but I won't. I'm going to do that tomorrow when I visit with some of your colleagues to deal with interior flooding in the Central Valley. But go ahead, Cameron. But it is repeated with respect to San Francisco. I know we pre-European time. I just used this map from Captain Beachy, kind of an ironic name, of San Francisco Bay, or portions of San Francisco Bay, to emphasize a point that Stu made. The bay is very shallow. You won't be able to see it very well here, but there are lots of emergent features in the bay in the 19th century, which are not present today. There are notes all over this map, you know, at low tide, this area is completely exposed. So lots of reefs, shell reefs, and, you know, when you say kind of like emergent mud flats all around the bay at the time. That's not the same today, right? For a variety of reasons. Next slide. So the bay has not always looked like it does today, is the point. And the question I'm going to ask you, so if it hasn't always looked like it does today, what's preventing us from making it look different in the future? With our engineering and science, right? Is there something sacrosanct about the landscape there that would prevent us from creating novel features that are in line with the trajectory? I suggest to you, no, there shouldn't be anything sacrosanct about that from an environmental standpoint, because I think the welfare of San Francisco Bay depends on you rejecting that idea. And because there's been a lot of transformation in San Francisco Bay, I mean, we used levees and other things, right, to transform. We need to think about transforming with a mind toward the future of the rest of the 21st century. And that has to involve nature-based solutions that look different than anything that's been here before. That's my opinion. But go on to the next slide for sake of time. We have a lot of hazards that we confront. And this slide doesn't include all the kinds of hazards, but we have human-made disasters in terms of industrial accidents and such. Then we have natural hazards, climate change associated with sea level rise and storms and drought, which you're familiar with, and combinations of these things. So we have a rich set of these, and the statistics are quite impressive and depressing at the same time. So there have been more than 330 climate or weather disasters in the United States since 1980 that have produced at least $1 billion in economic damage. More than 330 just since 1980. If you sum the total economic damages across all those events, more than $2 trillion in economic damage in the United States. In addition to that, more than 15,000 people in the US of A have been killed by weather since 1980. This is not a third world situation we're talking. This is in the United States of America. 15,000 of our fellow citizens have died in weather since 1980. So I'd suggest to you that our infrastructure that addresses kind of weather is not performing well currently. So the 20th century approach, all that rock and steel, I don't think we're getting as much payoff from it as we should be if you just look at those two statistics. Next slide. It's already been referred to. So we started this initiative in the Corps in 2010. Maybe not very many people knew about it in 2010 because when you're starting something, you know, not very many people know about it. But it's been going for 12 years. The whole purpose of this initiative is to develop and demonstrate the capability to deliver what we now call nature-based solutions. It was not a term of art in 2010, I can guarantee you. But it is now a current term of art. And there's a whole range of activities we have that we're pursuing. And I brought a few books that you guys can elbow your way to taking, but maybe just take one with you and then you can spread out the several that I bought, including some of the books that we've published to illustrate these kinds of projects. Next slide. So nature-based solutions, you can find a lot of different definitions in the literature actually, which is a bit of a problem. But this is my shorthand. You're talking about conserving, restoring, and engineering nature for the benefit of people and nature. And there are many different examples of this practice. Coastal storm risk management through building an island wetland complex to attenuate waves, okay? Or inland flood risk management. We would maybe call it a levee setback in the Corps of Engineers, but really what you're doing is restoring floodplain for the purposes that floodplains serve, and that is to store flood water, right? Surface, I'm going to visit a couple of these projects on Thursday in the Central Valley. Surface heat reduction. Trees are, you know, nature's air conditioner. It's lots of data about this. Drought and wildfire resilience. Restoring native ecosystems, you know, to reduce the risk of fire. Water resilience, restored floodplains that also recharge groundwater. And climate change mitigation, you know, storing carbon in the form of these restored ecosystems. It has to be a part of the solution. We can't work our way out of the hole we've dug for ourselves by emissions reductions alone. I mean, it won't happen, right? There's too much already in the system. So we have to accelerate sequestration. And we're not going to do that with giant vacuum cleaners like they want to use in Iceland to suck carbon out of the air. It has to be done with natural systems. So next slide, enough preaching on that. There's a lot of science that's emerging, a lot of science that's been produced on the effectiveness of nature-based solutions. This from a group of scientists that's sponsored by work within the Nature Conservancy, but also by Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's of London supported financially this report because the insurance industry is keenly interested in science and data supporting nature-based solutions. And what this group of researchers found using insurance industry models was that the existing inventory of wetlands in the Northeast Atlantic seaboard during Hurricane Sandy were responsible for avoiding or preventing more than $600 million of flood damages. So a lot of questions that would produce like, well, hey, if we could restore some more, what if we could increase the inventory of wetlands by 10% and do that in strategic locations? Could we convert that number into $1 billion? Or 2 billion the next time they have a storm, which of course they will. Next slide. So there are lots of data like that. We have established 7 engineering with nature proving grounds within the Corps. These are districts, and in the case of division, South Pacific Division, that have, you know, stepped forward to implement these kinds of approaches. And you are the beneficiaries of the fact you have 2 of these 7 organizations right here. The division under Colonel Gant's leadership, and the district, largely due to Stu's leadership, have committed themselves. He left the room to go to another thing. He warned me he was going to do that. He wasn't just, you know, commenting by using his feet on my talk. But you have 2 of these, so you need to leverage those commitments to do what you're talking about doing today. Next slide. So at the federal level, to complement the last panel's discussion, so IIJA, or sometimes referred to as Bill now. So there's literally billions of dollars of federal dollars being invested in natural infrastructure or nature-based solutions in that $1 trillion number of agencies. And it's still to be determined how those agencies are actually going to invest those monies. They're kind of working through that process. Next slide. I think very complementary to the state of California's emphasis here. I don't know, has anybody read this executive order? So Executive Order 14072, which the president issued on Earth Day of this year. So from April 22nd of this year, Section 4 of this executive order is titled Deploying Nature-Based Solutions to Tackle Climate Change and Enhance Resilience. And there are 3 commitments that are made within that executive order. It commits the federal government. In fact, the White House is leading an effort now to issue a report on how to accelerate this practice across federal agencies. And I've been on the working group contributing to that report. I just saw a draft of it Monday. The administration is going to carry this report into COP27 at the beginning of next month. You all, I respectfully suggest, need to become familiar with that report and figure ways to lever the commitments that are highlighted within it for your purposes. It also commits the government, largely through actions being taken by OMB and the Department of Commerce, to figure out how to value nature as a part of federal decision-making. And actually, the Department of Commerce is setting up a natural capital account as a way of actually tracking the value we derive from nature as a part of our economic management system within the United States. And then third, it commits the government to producing the first ever national nature assessment on par with the national climate assessment. And that project is proceeding. I'm actually Department of Defense's representative on the federal steering committee for that. That's really a game changer, that report I would submit to you, that's going to be produced and published in 2026. Takes a while to stand up things like that. Next slide. So here's my call to action. You're not the only people that have heard me say this, but I'm just being, maybe some would say audacious. The goal should be 100% beneficial use, period. And if you're not establishing a goal that you actually have to reach for, you're not really doing yourselves justice, right? So this should be the target. And now you're in a position, if you really do think that this should be the target, then now you're in a position to figure out, well, what really transformational things do we need to do to get there? Not pick around the edges. Let's carve a nickel off of our dredging costs. No, how do you get to 100% beneficial use in San Francisco Bay? That's what you should be asking yourselves, in my humble opinion. And a lot of things would have to happen in order to accomplish that. Like government agencies that do dredging, like the Corps, would have to do business differently, and they'd have to figure out what that would involve. Ports and the navigation sector would have to really buy into multi-purpose projects. It's not just about, making sure your ships have draft. There would have to be other, objectives with that. Regulatory agencies would have to figure out how to accomplish efficient win-wins. It can't be all about not having your ox gored, in the process. How do you get efficient win-wins? Dredging companies are going to have to bring more innovation in terms of their equipment, as well as how they operate that equipment. And environmental NGOs facilitating P3s, right? And Cameron has the PDFs of this, and I'm happy for him to distribute these to anybody who wants them. And the key to this, and this is back to my point about economics, the key to progress for you is the same as the key to progress for everybody, is affordability, affordability, affordability. And it's more than just shaving a nickel off of the per cubic yard cost, because it has to be something really big to be able to move to the targets that I think you all want. Next slide. We've done a lot of beneficial use over the last 100 years within the Corps of Engineers. We've gotten to the point nationally that we're doing somewhere between 30 and 40% beneficial use, but we've more or less been stuck on that number for probably 20 years. So to get to something more than that, and our chief of engineers has committed the organization in his testimony to Congress to get to 70 by 30. 70% beneficial use by 2030. That's a lean forward goal. How are we going to do that? It's almost effectively doubling what we're doing, but you can do better than that. I think you can start talking about 100% here in San Francisco. And it supports a whole range of benefits, and there are challenges that have already been addressed so far, so I won't repeat those. But the next slide. The federal standard's already been brought up, and I just put it up here because it's useful to have the words. It's actually three parts of it. The two that are most frequently mentioned are least costly and compliant with environmental standards, but there's this other criterion up there, is consistent with sound engineering practices. Now, I'm not a policy person, but I would suggest to you throwing away perfectly good resource is not consistent with sound engineering practice. You don't waste good material as a part of engineering, right? And then section 125 has also been mentioned, and this is why I mentioned both sides of the economics. So you have to work really hard to reduce costs, but you also need to figure out how to develop very condensed and impactful value statements for what you're delivering through beneficial use. And I heard a lot of great stuff spoken about in the sessions today, but how do you condense, like the monitoring work at Montezuma, how do you condense that information into a really impactful and dense value statement for beneficial use that's complementary to and supports decision-making on, well, we should be investing in beneficial use. The section 125 establishes U.S. policy for the Corps to maximize beneficial use. And beyond that, directs the Corps to consider the benefits of beneficial use in its decision making. And that's why I'm saying if you all can organize your case examples of the progress that you've been making to help us all collectively figure out how to make good, coherent, impactful value statements, I submit to you, you will attract resources to your program if you can figure that out. I think you can. Next slide. There's a whole range of types of beneficial use. And back on Stu's point, my impression from what I gathered from casually observing your activities here for the last several years is there's a lot of direct placement, which is very expensive. But there's a whole range of approaches and a whole range of engineering effort that's involved in doing beneficial use. And a lot of what you've been doing is really on the expensive end of that from an operational point of view, from what I've observed. So I'm not going to go into these examples here, but there's a whole range, and you need to be exploring the full spectrum of beneficial use opportunities, not just, you know, keeping yourself at the expensive end because maybe it delivers benefits in the quickest way. You know, think about the full spectrum. Next slide. Just some examples of what's been going on around the country. They do things, of course, on a different scale than the Gulf Coast. But this is a fantastic project in Biloxi, Mississippi. Mississippi, unfortunately, doesn't get to claim that it's leading in lots of things, but they're leading in beneficial use, I'm here to tell you. Maybe not on the scale of bigger states and such, but pretty much everything they dredge in Mississippi goes to a beneficial use project. And they built some fabulous ones, including this one at Deer Island in Biloxi. And I've been out on that island. It's a fantastic project. Next slide. All sorts of benefits. The importance of partnership. This is a project that we have with a whole bunch of partners, state and federal agencies at Swan Island. And partnership really is a key to advancing progress together because NOAA and the Corps have to figure out how to work together on beneficial use projects to advance those projects. And this was a beneficial use project in Baltimore District, restoring an island that actually protects a community in Ewell, Maryland. And so NOAA is looking at the ecology. We're looking at the engineering and the wave attenuation benefits of this project. That's, there's the engineering benefits and the environmental benefits. And in hearing of your case studies, how can we talk about both sides, the engineering and the economic benefits for resilience, as well as the environmental uplift that these projects produce? That's the full value argument, especially when you factor in the social and equity values of it. Next slide. You have to create the conditions for innovation. And we've been supporting our Philadelphia district in New Jersey for several years now, and they've created these conditions. And it was a hard road with New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Man, there were people, there was one individual in particular, I'll call him Jersey John. He could, with New Jersey DEP, he just couldn't get with the program. He wanted to test dioxin and everything and just adding costs, basically being an impediment to every beneficial use project. And when his bosses became aware of the problem that Jersey John was creating, Jersey John got moved to another job. And sometimes people are not equipped, their personality, they're in the wrong seat on the bus and they need to be moved to another seat on the bus. And that's what they did. And they've been going gangbusters ever since then. Okay. And they've been building beneficial use projects, first of their kind ever in the state of New Jersey. Now, they were motivated to do that because of all the damage they suffered in Hurricane Sandy, but hopefully you guys can do that without having a major environmental catastrophe, in the Bay. But you got to create these conditions, and you got to be willing to try new stuff, even when there are going to be risks. And that you cannot get innovation without risk-taking, period. And you're going to fail sometimes, and that's going to be okay. And if you haven't created those conditions for risk-taking, there will be no innovation here or anywhere else. Next slide. Mobile Bay, there's another interesting example that has some parallels with San Francisco Bay. Some environmental interests thought it was really a great idea back in the 1980s to ban in-bay disposal of sediment in Mobile Bay. And they actually got it codified in WRDA 86. Thou shalt take all dredge material to the ocean disposal site. And that inflated substantially the cost of dredging. And over the next, decade and a half or more, all sorts of bad things started happening when several million yards of sediments being exported out of the bay, like shoreline erosion, loss of wetlands. And so the stakeholders got together under the leadership of the Mobile district, and they reversed that decision and actually got that provision in WRDA 86 repealed. And that enabled us to go from hopper dredging to cutter head dredging. And now they saved $10 million plus a year in lower dredging costs, and they've increased their opportunities for beneficial use. So back on Stu's point about the equipment and the operational aspects of the engineering, this is very important. And, there are all sorts of parallels with what happened in Mobile Bay. Next slide. You need to document the benefits. This has got a great story associated with it, where the New Orleans district dredging on the Atchafalaya River, which is a very muddy system, they needed an alternative for managing the dredge material in the Atchafalaya River. And what ended up being the best alternative was actually to dredge the sediment out of the channel, but place it in the river. And their technical point of view was if they supplied the sediment to the river itself engineer its own mid-river island. And that's exactly what happened. So over the course of about 10 years, they created an 85-acre mid-river island out of dredge material that has no stone or sheet pile or anything. The river engineered it. All the Corps did was supply the material to the river. And it's this beautiful habitat, tremendous environmental value. But in addition to that, that island now functions as a river engineer would describe as a river training structure. So now that portion of the Atchafalaya River actually moves sediment. That portion of the channel actually moves sediment more efficiently than it did before because of increased flow velocities and things like that. So now the New Orleans district saves about $4 million a year in less dredging costs because of a natural feature that was created by simply modifying how they were managing the sediment at no additional cost. This idea that beneficial use is always more expensive is hogwash. And you cannot accept that as a premise that beneficial use is always going to be more expensive. Please do not do that, because there are plenty of opportunities out there at the same cost and even less cost. And if you buy into the premise that it's always going to be more expensive, you're probably not going to be innovating or thinking creatively across the space available to you. Next slide. Cutterhead dredging there too. We have a project right now doing a policy research effort looking at the benefits of nature-based solutions. And we're going to have a national summit in Washington, D.C., hosted at the National Academy of Sciences on the 30th of November. It's going to be a public meeting, in person and virtual. We're starting to advertise it now, where we're going to share the results of our policy analysis. How can we do a better job of capturing the full array of benefits that nature-based solutions can produce for a whole variety of purposes? And we're going to invite others to come in and share their experience in trying to do the same thing so we can learn from each other. Next slide. Well, I don't have to talk to this group about sustainability, but it's an old idea. If you go back to NEPA had a very concise definition of sustainability that we're still not living up to, trying to find productive harmony with nature. That's basically what you all are trying to do, and most of us are in many places. Next slide. There's a lot of science supporting nature-based solutions effectiveness, and there's a whole range of approaches to getting there, including the use of physical modeling, numerical modeling, the study of natural analogs, scale demonstration projects, which are so important. You got to learn from what you're doing, and a whole range of experience, including traditional ecological knowledge that can be applied to the evidence base necessary to support these kinds of decisions. But again, it's not possible to eliminate all the uncertainties associated with taking new action. You have to take risks to innovate. Next slide. Published an international guide on the use of nature-based solutions for flood risk management, coastal and riverine. It's a 1,000-page technical guide. You can download it from the website. 6,000 people have over the last 12 months. It's the #1 downloaded product within the Corps of Engineers for the last year. And we developed this international guide with more than 75 partnering organizations around the world, more than 170 contributors and authors. It doesn't answer every question, but it's a good start. I think 1,000 pages on how to approach this. Next slide. We had a National Academy of Engineering workshop earlier this summer that you can actually go to the website that's captured there at the bottom. They produced a summary report of the workshop focused on natural infrastructure opportunities. Great discussion. They have the video for the whole meeting as well as every presentation on the Academy's website. Next slide. Designing for nature-based solutions. This is something I would encourage you to take on board, is that one of the challenges that we have is inspiring the public as well as, our agency and organizational colleagues about nature-based solutions. And one of the ways that we can do that is by drawing from the practice of design, like landscape architecture. So people can actually see what this future will look like, okay, in tangible ways. And those reports at the top of the slide are all reports that we've published that are on the Engineering with Nature website, where we've taken landscape architects from universities and private practice into core teams considering new projects and let them work together to come up with innovative approaches to incorporate nature-based solutions. And I think it's a very powerful tool, design and communicating that through the means that architects have. Next slide. Getting close to the end. This has been referred to several times this morning. How do we support people and communities through these actions? There's lots of tie-ins here for EJ and equity and for everybody's benefit. People need more access to nature. Living behind concrete walls is not a human way to exist. So there's lots of value arguments to be made here in terms of even just very tangible things like supporting health and psychological well-being that I won't get into for sake of time again. But next slide. If you like that topic, that the book Nature Fix is a very good introduction to it. But there are a lot of parallel activities that need to be synchronized, I think, to revolutionize practice in this respect. Policy development's already been referred to here. How do we synchronize that with really more substantial partnering? We have to figure out how to upscale partnering if we want to upscale beneficial use and nature-based solutions. Innovation, it happens deliberately. On the ground projects and demos, you guys have a lot of those, and mining those for arguments as well as persuading others, I think, is very important and is not necessarily always pursued with the investment that it should. And then how do you strategically communicate better, not just with each other, but with other audiences? We spend a lot of money collecting data, but oftentimes only spend a penny or two actually using that data to communicate effective messages to others that really matter in the decision-making. Next slide. I'm almost to the end. And that we've made a lot of investments in that in Engineering with Nature, including these atlases and other publications in the back and our website, our podcasts. We've had more than 20,000 downloads of our episodes on Engineering with Nature podcast. We're in the top 10%. This is a government podcast. We're in the top 10% of all science and nature podcasts. There's a demand and interest and appetite for information on this subject that you need to tap into because you've got a lot to share. Next slide. This is the last. And with your indulgence, I'm just going to read this. So the successful appendectomy that our granddaughter had was done through laparoscopy, which is the way most appendectomies are done today. And while I was thinking about this and preparing for a conference on innovation within the Corps of Engineers, I ran across this journal article written at the time by the president of the Society for laparoendoscopic surgery. And I captured this paragraph. MDs are not known as writers, but I think he captures very well the essence of what's necessary in innovation. So with your indulgence, I'll just read it with you since those in the back may not. It says, the changes in surgical endoscopy leading up to 1988 were in fact gradual and evolutionary. For any major change or progress to take place, many factors must fall into place. In the case of laparoscopy, dramatic technical innovations were required. Additionally, there is a season for any change, requiring a favorable and supportive philosophical environment. Authoritative institutions must be convinced of the safety and efficacy of the changes relative to the comfortable status quo. Momentum always favors inertia. Fears must be overcome. Fear of making mistakes, fear of failure, fear of established procedures becoming obsolete, and fear of established authorities losing control. Successful change requires timing and a force more powerful than the status quo. The strongest force for sustainable change is a worthy goal. You all have plenty of worthy goals in San Francisco Bay. And I think those words could be used to maybe combine with what you think needs to happen, because you need to get after it. And I'm going to echo finally Stu's point. Action, you got to take action now. And you need to think revolutionary and not incremental. The time for incremental is over. Think be shook up, as we might say in some places in the country. So with that, I ran over maybe a smidgen, but thanks for your time. Any rebuttals or?
Yeah, now time for the rebuttal. Now that's a great talk. Thank you. We've heard a similar theme over time, really. When your system that you're working is some of what we've discussed today gets us to an important time. The value of beneficial reuse outweigh the individual species that might be impacted by doing some of the things that we're talking about. So I don't know if you can reflect on any of that kind of higher philosophical.
Yeah.
component.
Well, the species issue is an important one. And one way I would frame this in terms of like habitat switching would be a term I would use. Okay, so you're talking about building an island that was never there before. And this is one of those sacrosanct things. You can't build novel stuff. Well, if we don't start building novel things, we're going to drown. So would you rather have a novel concrete flood wall, that's 15 feet tall? Or would you rather have a shorter wall with an island, wetland, reef complex, okay? So we're going to have to work through those things, because I don't want to trivialize issues about individual species, kind of onesies. But I think we can lift all boats. It's going to require some openness and some risk taking. And that's why I try to highlight New Jersey, because they've worked through a lot of those issues. And there's been a lot of environmental habitat value that's been created actually from past kind of incidental dredge material management. There are a lot of islands in the bay in New Jersey that were created just from overland disposal of sediment. The next thing you know, something was living on it. And now it's kind of interesting because it's come full circle where some regulators in New Jersey didn't want to allow more placement of sediment on those islands because it's too valuable as habitat. Well, the island would not have been there but for dredge material. So that's where we can kind of get in our own way. And I have other specific cases of that problem. So they need to be worked through, but I think there's a way to create win-wins. It's not fantasy. If people think whenever we're managing dredge material, we're creating some engineering value that the environment always loses in that, that's also a premise to reject. It's hogwash.
And it wouldn't be a Bay Planning Coalition meeting if Jim Levine didn't have a comment. So maybe a question. Okay, I'll just repeat it.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you repeat it?
Yeah. So the question Jim had is, when will OMB, say Department of Commerce, work on valuing nature be incorporated into the Corps of Engineers process? So there are multiple ways to answer this question. So one of the things that OMB is doing right now is they're updating their what's called A4 guidance, which gets to this idea of benefit cost analysis and how it's done. So they've received charges from the president, from the White House to revise and update, modernize how benefit cost analysis is done. Of course, that will impact the Corps of Engineers in due course. But in a more immediate way, our current Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, Mike Connor, has committed the agency to implementing the principles, requirements, and guidelines, which every other federal agency implemented. The Corps has not. There was a rider attached to all of our appropriations bills that prevented us from doing that, but that was removed several years ago. So the Assistant Secretary's office is proceeding with implementation of the PRNG through rulemaking, actually, right now. That process is underway. And the PRNG provides, I would say, benefits are evaluated in the context of decision making. Now, the Corps, 35,000 plus employees, it's going to take a while for the Corps to learn its way into doing that. So it's going to be, a process. But this kind of transformation of doing more comprehensive benefit evaluation is underway within the Corps, I would submit. But you all developing case examples of this, condensed, impactful value argument could actually inform what happens within the Corps. I would try to attach some urgency to you all to try to use the case studies you have now to develop those kinds of arguments and to share them.
So where would we present those that would be most impactful then to that audience?
There are a number of ways we could talk offline about doing that. First would be to engage in conversation with the district and with district engineers and the economists, maybe even invite them into the process of developing these case studies, then to the division. Then there's no reason why you couldn't engage headquarter policymakers and others on here's our 6 examples, and this is how we think they intersect with the PRNG and how you should be doing things. So there are any number of ways, but you all need to take the initiative to initiate that conversation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. Appreciate your candor and your perspective. So big round of applause, please. And then I'll transition then to John Coleman to give the closing remarks for the workshop.
Thank you very much for all of you who attended in person and those who are on the virtual side of it. Again, you heard this is our first attempt since the pandemic began to have a hybrid meeting. So there are a few glitches as one would expect, but I think it went extremely smooth all in all. And we're going to look at doing our CEQA meeting on November 7th the same way. We wanted to evaluate this and then see how that went. And then we're going to have another event, which we may do the same way, which is our post-election on November 29th. We could not have done this without all the sponsors today. So thank you, thank you, thank you. The sponsors really help drive and provide the financial for us to do these special events and workshops. And this is an annual workshop, great one, and we always get good conversation. All the PowerPoints will be posted to our website tomorrow. If you had questions that were not asked because of time, we will then submit them to the people those who asked the questions will submit them to those who were asking to get a response to be able to get them back to everybody. Bottom line, if you're not a member of BPC, we encourage you to join. But there are takeaways from today. The takeaways are there's many challenges, but those challenges are also opportunities. We have a lot to do in front of us, and we can't do it alone. We need more money. We always need more money, and the state of California has to come up to help bear some of the cost on dredging here in California, like other states do,
throughout the nation so that we can do more dredging and more beneficial reuse. In the state of California, it needs to step up to the plate on doing that. We need more sediment. We heard that we're going to need 450 million cubic million yards by the year 2100. That's a lot of sediment if we're going to try and be able to protect our assets, our environment, our ecology, and improve the ecology of our area. We need more partnerships. We can't do it alone. In one point in the world, everybody had their own silo and box. That doesn't work anymore. Today, from whether it be Congress or other activities, it's collaboration, it's partnership, and that allows us to do more with less. And that's going to some of what Dr. Todd Bridges talked about. We need bay-wide solutions to do it. And what we need to do now for climate change and sea level rise and ecosystem health is think differently, be creative, be innovative, and be willing to take risks. And right now, we need to take action. We are going to take you up on that charge, Todd. We will work with the district and the division and necessarily headquarters to look at how we can do things differently and put a price and an evaluation on what we're doing and how it can be better spread and more of the cost can be coming back here and we can do more with less. That's what our charge is. So thank you for participating and look forward to seeing you hopefully at our CEQA event or our post-election. Thank you very much.